please make sure you press the mute button, which is located in the lower left corner of the Zoom application. Failing to do so may cause echo or feedback for other participants. For meetings where there is interpretation, if you are listening to an interpretation channel and you wish to take the floor, it is essential to select Off on the Zoom interpreting function before doing so. Once you are finished, you can switch back to the interpretation channel. Should you have a prepared text of your speech or any written notes, please send it to the following address: documents.interpret@oecd.org. Should you encounter technical difficulties, you may use the Zoom chat function to contact the meeting host or co-host, or send an email to the following address: conference.support@oecd.org. Thank you for your attention and cooperation.
Hello everyone, bienvenue à tous. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you all today for the meeting of the Policy Dialogue on Social Protection and Development. Please don't forget to mute yourself. I'm Antoine Bonnet from the OECD Development Center. I work at the Social Cohesion Unit on social protection, informality, and the green transition, and I will be facilitating the flow throughout these 2 days, where we will, from 1 to 4:30 p.m. Paris time, today and tomorrow, discuss how social protection can play a key role in the context of overlapping crises leading to growing vulnerability and poverty. And now I would like to introduce Raga Arnadotir. Raga, you're the director of the OECD Development Center, and we are looking very much forward to your introductory remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and a huge welcome to all of you, dear participants and colleagues. A warm thank you from all of us to the steering committee representatives that are here with us today. A big thank you to our co-organizers, the Secretariat of the Universal Social Protection 2030 initiative, and to my colleagues, Sara Ravasi, the director of the ILO Social Protection Department, and Michael Rutkowski, the global director for social protection and jobs at the World Bank. As all of you who are here with us today know, the whole world is suffering from record levels of inflation. And those paying the high price and the highest price are low and middle income countries, and within those countries, the poorest households. Could I just stop for a moment and ask, there's someone who's not muted. I don't know if, it's gone. Thank you. In the sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, food prices have surged by nearly 24%. Globally, the combined effect of the pandemic and inflation is expected to throw an additional 75 to 95 million people into poverty. Meanwhile, the climate shocks will continue to strike in countries with limited food, limited water, and economic resources, with devastating consequences. Up to 130 million people could fall into extreme poverty because of climate change by 2030. This is a bleak picture that I'm painting. And we are here today to discuss the critical role that social protection can play to prevent people and entire households from falling into poverty in light of the multiple crises. For households to durably escape poverty and build resilience to future shocks, we will discuss how social protection systems can do a better job at adapting to a volatile inflationary environment and to move from ideas to action we will discuss how to integrate social protection as an essential dimension of national development strategies. So there's a lot on our table, on our plates for the 2 days of discussion. And I look forward to learning from each and every one of you and to what I'm very sure will be a thought-provoking policy dialogue on social protection and development. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Raga. Now, I would like to introduce Shara Razavi. Shara, you are the Director for Social Protection at the International Labour Organization. Thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So thanks very much for that invitation, and very warm greetings to everyone who's joining online, and warm greetings to Raga Arnardottir and Mikhail Rutkovsky, who are here with me today. I want to say congratulations to colleagues for organizing this very timely policy dialogue on social protection and development, which is co-hosted by OECD and USP2030, representing the ILO as one of the co-chairs of USP2030 with my colleague Mikhail. I would really like to warmly welcome you to this event, where we have the opportunity to exchange experiences and join up, our expertise. I think, as already Raga stated, the state of the world we're living in is such today that we really need to have an approach that is, all hands on deck, to be able to really withstand the multiple crises that we are facing, crises that are really pushing millions of people behind and increasing the levels of inequality that were already pretty unacceptable to start with, and creating discontent and loss of hope, particularly among younger generation. So it's a pretty grim situation, I think, that we're in, and the world is in many ways at a critical juncture as countries struggle to cope with the multiple crises that we have, economic, social, environmental, together with violent conflict. Now, while the impact of COVID has waned in most countries, multiple and very much overlapping economic and political crises are today threatening labor market recovery around the world. And this is not just for developing countries, it's really a worldwide phenomenon. And these crises are likely to further increase labor market inequalities due to the disproportionate impact on certain groups of workers and firms, while contributing to the growing divergence between developed and developing economies. The latest ILO statistics that we have from the ILO Monitor shows that in the third quarter of 2022, the hours worked were 1.5% below the level of the fourth quarter of 2019, which is the pre-crisis benchmark. This is equivalent to a deficit of about 40 million full-time jobs. Also, we know that progress in narrowing gender gaps in hours worked is at risk because of the slowdown in recovery. And at the same time, we know that something like 2 billion people are still living and working in the informal forms of employment, very often living and working under very difficult conditions with very little access to adequate social protection. So at the same time, while the COVID crisis really underscored the fact that social protection is a must for all countries, and building universal social protection systems that provide kind of comprehensive and adequate protection across people's life cycle is not only a human right, but also an economic and political stabilizer. Today, many countries are really struggling, and this is not just low-income countries, but many countries are struggling to find the physical space that they need to make the much needed investments in their social protection systems. And unfortunately, our international financial architecture just does not seem to be fit for purpose, and it's unable to provide the support that countries need. So at this moment, there is an even greater need for concerted action and cooperation if we are to better manage and eventually, exit from these kind of multiple crises that the world is facing. And we really need to place the pursuit of decent work for all and universal social protection at the heart of the recovery efforts if we are to really usher in a new era that is marked by social justice, or shared prosperity, as the World Bank calls it, and lasting peace. So to this end, I think it was really important, the timing that the UN Secretary General launched in September of 2021, the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions, which is being coordinated by the ILO as part of a UN-wide effort. And this kind of global accelerator really aims to ensure that we have the necessary policy support and the necessary financing for countries to be able to create the millions of jobs that are missing, particularly in the care and the green and the digital sectors, and to extend social protection to the more than 4 billion people who currently do not have any kind of coverage. Now, I think it's a no-brainer that countries really cannot build these universal social protection systems if they don't, at the same time, if they don't have the capacity to create decent employment opportunities that can generate the fiscal resources for social protection, whether it's through taxation or through the contributory system. So in our view, in this moment, weakening existing forms of social protection in favor of kind of private or individual saving mechanisms will not really provide the adequate levels of protection that we'll need, and may in fact even erode the existing forms of protection. And so we think there is a lot to be said about really trying to extend existing forms of social insurance to really cover workers in diverse forms of employment. And many countries have successfully done so, and we need to learn from those lessons to be able to cover, part-time workers, temporary workers, self-employed workers, and domestic workers, and so forth. And what is really needed for the future is to be able to adequately cover workers in all types of employment. So let me just end by really saying that in addition to social protection policies, we really need to combine this with employment policies and adequate labor market regulation to really have sustainable and equitable outcomes. And so on that, let me just end by saying that, for the social protection systems of the future, we really need to be based on a set of very broad policy principles that can ensure the comprehensive and adequate and sustainable coverage for all, which is so central to our USP2030 partnership, and to have sufficient adaptability to new requirements in a very fast-changing world, and while also being able to ensure sustainability and equity. So let me again, as co-chair of USP 2030, welcome this exchange on country experiences today and tomorrow that we will be having to really help us understand better how we can build systems that will be, comprehensive, universal, and sustainable. So thank you so much, and I hand over back to you, Alexander.
Thank you very much, Shara. I'm Antoine Bonnet. Alexandre Kolev is also here with us. We're in the same team. Now, I would like to introduce you to Michal Rutkowski, last but certainly not least. You are the Global Director for Social Protection and Jobs at the World Bank. Michal, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antoine. Thank you very much, colleagues. Let me start by thanking USP 2030, which we are co-chairing, but first and foremost, the OECD Development Center for organizing this very important event. It's a pleasure to be here and to co-open the session with Raga Arnadotir, the director of the OECD Development Center, and Shara Razavi, director of the Social Protection Department in the ILO. It is very timely, and both Shara and Raga explained very well why it is so timely. Let me frame the rest of the day in the following way, that in our very recent publication, which is our Social Protection and Jobs Compass, we identified 5 major gaps which need to be filled for social protection systems to deliver in a current environment, which is very volatile and very difficult, especially for the poorest. The first gap is a coverage gap. And here you colleagues would know that even among the poorest quintile, less than 20% of people receive any form of social protection. So we are facing enormous challenge of the coverage gap in the developing world. Then there is a flexibility gap, by which we mean the ability of social protection system to adapt to very quickly changing circumstances. When we wrote it, our changing circumstances were shocks, primarily either man-made or natural, ranging from floods and droughts to wars, but inflation wasn't that high on our mind then, but inflation is yet another shock to which the immediate adjustment of social protection systems is needed, and the flexibility gap is exposed again. The third was the opportunity gap. In any environment, inflationary or not, we need to connect people to opportunities in the labor market, and you need to connect them to the value chains so that they can go up the ladder of good jobs, starting very often not with good jobs, but then moving up the ladder towards more sustainable and better jobs, very often involving migrating to secondary cities and then big cities. And that opportunity gap is a big challenge. Financing gap. And financing gap is a huge challenge in the inflationary environment when we talk about domestic financing. But please, if we look at developing world, we would see that in so many countries, especially in Africa, almost 95% of financing in some of them comes from foreign resources, from donors. And that is not a model that we would like to be sustained. We'd like domestic resource mobilization to take place and to take over from foreign financing. Finally, the delivery gap. You can have everything in place in terms of filling all those 4 gaps I mentioned, but still not being able to deliver right benefits on time to intended recipients. And that challenge is in a way transcending the times of inflation. It's always with us, and it's extremely important because without it, and this is not only payment, it's the whole delivery chain, starting with enrollment, with case management, with payments, but also with grievance mechanisms afterwards. So we are facing the challenge of filling those 5 gaps. And I would like to end by saying that in the current environment, in which rightly so USP 2030 and OECD Development Center emphasize the inflationary environment, especially the food and energy price inflation, there are additional challenges that are so much on the table. And one of those challenges is very clearly the ability to adjust social benefits in a very volatile inflationary environment, ensuring food and nutrition security. And this is why I am so glad to see that in this conference, we will have ample time spent on talking about how can social protection and agriculture policies be coordinated to tackle food and nutrition insecurity, which is absolutely fundamental given the challenges at hand. And it is not that relevant to realize how endogenous those challenges are, because they are partly endogenous, because they are a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in a significant part. But we would have inflationary environment for other reasons as well in various periods of time. So it has a big importance independent of those circumstances. And I am very happy to see in the program that it is highlighted, that it will be discussed. And I think it is a very well conceived conference with a very careful drafting of the program that focuses not only on the issues that are fundamental for social protection systems in a sort of eternal long-term perspective, but also the issues that are particularly important in the current environment that is characterized by food and energy inflation, and which is also characterized by the environmental degradation and climate shocks, which is with us, unfortunately, to stay. And we need to work hard to make sure that social protection systems can respond. Again, big thanks to USP 2030 and to OECD Development Center, and good luck for the course of the conference. Thank you. Antoine, I think you are muted.
Thank you, Michel. We've been trying to be hybrid for 2.5 years, and still we have some glitches. Thank you so much, Raga, Shara, and Michel, for your introductory remarks. I think it perfectly sets the scene for our conversation over these 2 days. Now, I would like to introduce you to Ugo Gentilini, who is the lead for social assistance at the World Bank, who will be moderating our first session on social protection in a context of high inflation. Ugo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Antoine. Welcome. I'm Ugo Gentilini, Global Lead for Social Assistance at the World Bank, and I have the pleasure indeed to moderate this exciting session on social protection and the unprecedented food and energy price inflation. Inflation is having very concrete effects on people's lives and livelihoods. As Raga mentioned in her remarks, COVID-19 has increased by 71 million, the number of people living on less than $2.15 a day, and at least an additional 18 million people are now below that line due to inflation. And in this context, fiscal policy, including social protection, is in a tough spot as it needs to balance competing objectives. On one hand, there is a need to rebuild fiscal space after substantial spending during the pandemic and to coexist with monetary policy in its fight against inflation. And on the other hand, fiscal policy needs to help mitigate the harsh impact of higher energy and food prices on people. And in practice, we see a lot of action. There are over 600 social protection measures to counter inflation implemented across nearly 160 economies. A total of over 300 billion is being invested in social protection responses, and these measures cover 900 million people, over 600 million of whom are supported by cash transfers. Against this backdrop, a range of tough questions are emerging. For example, how can social protection help respond to multiple crises in a way that meets food security, nutrition, agriculture, and other key challenges, as Michal underscored in his intervention? How can assistance be delivered effectively in a volatile inflationary environment? And how can social protection systems help balance short and longer term priorities? We will discuss these questions today with a stellar panel of speakers, including Ousmane Basset, Director for Strategies and Planning at the General Directorate for Social Protection and National Solidarity of Senegal. Welcome, Ousmane. Frederic Dos Santos, who's Executive Administrator at the National Institute for Social Security in Cape Verde. Welcome, Frederic. Sarah Hunt, Policy Director in the Development Cooperation and Africa Division of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. Hi, Sarah, welcome. And Felipe Jardim Riberius Lins, who's General Coordinator of Articulation and Intersectoral Actions at the Department of Assistance and Benefits at the National Secretariat of Social Assistance in Brazil. Hi, Felipe, welcome. After Felipe's remarks, we will hear from two fantastic discussants, Marco Knowles, who's Senior Social Protection Officer at FAO, and Dominic Richardson, Chief of Social and Economic Policy Analysis at UNICEF's Innocenti Center in Florence. Welcome, Marco and Dominic. So for everyone, feel free to post questions in the chat and I will relay them to the speakers. Each speaker has 7 minutes. I will raise my hand 1 minute before the time is out, so speakers know that it's almost time to wrap up. But without further ado, let me pass the mic to Ousmane for his presentation on Senegal.
Merci Hugo, bonjour à tous et merci à l'OCDE en tout cas de nous avoir associés à cet événement important. Et donc, je ne vais pas présenter le Sénégal, mais comme vous le savez, le Sénégal est un pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest qui occupe une position stratégique qui est le pays africain le plus proche à la fois de l'Amérique et de l'Europe. donc avec une population d'à peine un peu plus de 17 millions en 2021, donc avec un PIB par habitant d'environ 1237 € en 2021, bien sûr. Et donc, avant de peut-être répondre aux questions, juste dire qu'effectivement, nous avons une politique de protection sociale et qui est bâtie autour du cycle de vie et qui cherche à faire en sorte que tous Sénégalais et Sénégalaises puissent accéder à un système de protection sociale, à un revenu minimum garanti, mais également à une assurance santé. Et ça, quand même, c'est important et nous y travaillons depuis une dizaine d'années. Et aujourd'hui, c'est vrai que nous n'avons pas un système complet, mais nous nous réjouissons d'avoir un certain nombre quand même de prestations qui nous valent des satisfactions. Donc, pour répondre à la question, effectivement, aujourd'hui, quelle a été la stratégie du Sénégal pour faire face à cette série de crises? Comme les autres pays du monde, le Sénégal a eu à prendre un certain nombre d'initiatives parce que quand des crises comme ça se superposent, la plupart du temps, se baser sur les instruments de protection sociale est la première chose, mais après aussi, on peut mettre en place de nouveaux projets, programmes. Donc, les mesures que le Sénégal a prises sont des mesures qui ont été nombreuses, mais aussi diversifiées. D'abord, quand la COVID a fait son apparition le 2 mars en 2020, nous avons mis en place ce qu'on appelle l'aide alimentaire. L'aide alimentaire, c'était sous forme de transfert non monétaire, donc aux populations qui sont les plus impactées. Donc, c'était un kit d'à peine 66 000, si en termes d'euros, c'est à peine 99 € par ménage, donc qui a été donné à 1 million de ménages, 1 100 000 ménages. Et donc, nous y sommes allés rapidement parce que nous avons utilisé le registre national unique, qui est une base de données où il y a l'ensemble de la population vulnérable et pauvre. Et donc, le ciblage a été fait sur cette base-là. Mais ce qui a été un peu le hic, c'était que la base de données était très insuffisante par rapport à la population donc, ciblée. Parce qu'on voulait aller à 1 million de ménages alors que la base du RNU, Registre National Unique, était à peine à 588 000 ménages. Et donc, il fallait faire un autre ciblage d'à peine 400 000 ménages, mais en utilisant le dispositif du RNU parce qu'il y avait un dispositif qui était très huilé. Et donc, finalement, 1 million de ménages a bénéficié donc, de ce transfert non monétaire. Et l'État aussi a pensé à ses fils qui étaient hors du Sénégal, notamment la diaspora, dans les pays qui étaient les plus impactés. Donc, l'État a pu dégager 12 milliards 500 millions donc pour venir en aide à ces populations qui étaient d'habitude dans les pays européens, la France, l'Italie, voilà. Et donc, c'était donné aux consulats et aux ambassades. Il s'agit maintenant de faire cela aussi sous forme de transfert monétaire. Donc, l'autre mesure qui est importante aussi, qui mérite d'être soulignée toujours pendant la COVID, c'était le paiement de factures d'électricité et d'eau. Parce que quand on sait que les familles modestes qui ont été les plus impactées ont eu aussi des difficultés à faire face à ces charges donc, en matière d'électricité. Et l'État s'est chargé donc d'appuyer ces familles-là donc en prenant en charge la consommation donc, de 2 mois, que ce soit l'eau, que ce soit l'électricité. Donc, pour l'électricité, c'était autour de 15 milliards, 15 milliards 500 millions. Et pour l'eau, c'était autour de 3 milliards. Donc, ça aussi, ça a été important. Ça a permis donc de soulager les populations. Donc, les 3 mesures dont je viens de parler font partie d'un ensemble de mesures qui a été plus vaste, qui n'étaient pas seulement des mesures de protection sociale. Et c'était un programme qu'on a appelé le programme de résilience économique et sociale, que l'État a eu à mettre en place, notamment le président de la République, après s'être concerté avec toutes les forces vives de la nation. je ne m'étends pas sur ce programme-là, mais l'autre stratégie qui a été mise en place, c'est que quand il y a eu l'inflation l'année dernière au mois de février, donc au niveau de l'UEMOA, on était passé à plus de 4,5 points d'inflation et le Sénégal était l'un des pays les plus marqués au mois de juillet parce qu'après, il s'était révélé que Dakar était devenue la ville la plus chère donc, de l'Afrique de l'Ouest derrière Abidjan, parce qu'on sait qu'Abidjan était la ville la plus chère. Et de ce point de vue, l'État a corsé donc les mesures. Et il a mis en place un cash transfert exceptionnel donc pour tous les ménages du RNU. Le RNU, comme je le disais, c'était une base de données où il y avait tous les ménages donc, vulnérables. Donc, c'était un transfert, cette fois-ci monétaire, donc de 80 000 qui a été donné à chaque ménage donc, de ce RNU. Et donc, c'était autour de 588 000 ménages donc, qui ont eu à bénéficier donc, de ce transfert. Et ça a coûté autour de 43 milliards. Donc, l'autre stratégie aussi, c'était toujours le cash transfert. Donc, un cash transfert, mais cette fois-ci, dans le côté de l'éducation, parce qu'à l'ouverture, les populations font face à beaucoup de dépenses et pour éviter les décrochages et permettre aux familles donc, de pouvoir payer les frais d'inscription et de continuer à envoyer les élèves à l'école, donc l'État a pensé à mettre en place un cash transfert pour le maintien des élèves aussi à l'école. Et à ce niveau-là, on a fait aussi une discrimination positive en pensant aussi aux élèves handicapés et c'est une opération donc, qui a été mise en œuvre par la délégation, la structure où nous sommes, mais avec le ministère de l'Éducation et le bailleur qui était l'UNICEF. Donc, face aussi à l'inflation, l'État a pensé revaloriser les salaires. Donc, en août 2022, le gouvernement a procédé donc à des mesures de revalorisation généralisée. Effectivement, parce qu'avant, il y avait des hausses qui ont été opérées pour certaines catégories, mais quand l'inflation était devenue plus pointue, donc l'État a pensé à généraliser donc, ces hausses de salaire qui allaient entre 80 000 et 300 000 selon la catégorie et l'agent fonctionnaire. Et face à cette inflation toujours, l'État a récemment fait des concertations, donc à travers le ministère du Commerce, donc a constitué autour de 18 commissions qui étaient chargées de réfléchir sur les stratégies pour faire face à la vie chère. Et le résultat, c'est qu'il y a eu des baisses sur les prix des produits de première consommation, notamment le riz, notamment l'huile, notamment le sucre. Mais il y a eu aussi des baisses sur le loyer parce qu'on sait que le loyer aussi grève le budget donc, des ménages donc, moyens. Et sur aussi les inscriptions à l'école et la scolarité. Donc, voilà un peu quelques mesures que je voulais partager à ce niveau-là. Maintenant, comment tout ça a été financé? Bien sûr, comme il est apparu, une crise comme ça ou des crises comme ça qui se superposent a besoin de toutes les forces, en tout cas vives donc, de la nation. Et c'est ce que l'État a compris pour ouvrir en tout cas le financement aussi bien aux partenaires techniques et financiers qu'aux privés sénégalais, mais également tout simplement aux bonnes volontés. Et donc, le plan de résilience économique et sociale, dans lequel il y avait le volet assistance alimentaire, donc a été financé par l'État, donc à hauteur de 100 millions, mais aussi par les partenaires techniques et financiers à hauteur de 650 milliards, oui, milliards. Et aussi, il y a eu un élan de solidarité qui a permis de collecter à peine 20 milliards. Et c'était autour de 1000 milliards donc, pour financer tout ce programme donc, de résilience économique et sociale. Maintenant, quant au transfert, c'était beaucoup plus un partenariat avec les bailleurs de fonds qui a permis donc d'exécuter ces projets. Notamment, le cash transfert pour éviter le décrochage a été financé par l'UNICEF et le cash transfert exceptionnel donc de 80 000 qui a été attribué aux ménages du RNU a été sur financement donc, de la Banque mondiale.
Ousmane, sorry to interrupt. We may need to wrap up. Just 30 seconds, please.
OK. Maintenant, OK. Merci pour comment tout ça a été coordonné avec, avec le système de sécurité alimentaire. Effectivement, il y avait quand même des organes qui ont été mis en place pour coordonner tout ça, mais surtout l'appui alimentaire a été capitalisé par la structure qui est chargée de coordonner la sécurité alimentaire, notamment le secrétariat exécutif du Conseil national de sécurité alimentaire. Donc, il a capitalisé. Maintenant, quant aux autres opérations, c'était beaucoup plus des opérations qui se sont basées sur le système de protection sociale, mais non sur le système de sécurité alimentaire. Maintenant, comment ces mesures peuvent-ils être intégrées dans la protection sociale pour la rendre plus réactive au choc et renforcer la résilience? Moi, de mon point de vue, je pense que le Sénégal a un atout. L'atout, c'est d'abord d'avoir un registre national unique, qui est un instrument quand même qui est important en matière de protection sociale. Et aujourd'hui, cet instrument est en train de passer à l'échelle parce qu'on sera l'année prochaine autour de 1 million de ménages. L'autre atout que le Sénégal a, c'est d'avoir l'un des transferts monétaires les plus importants de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, c'est-à-dire le programme national de bourse de sécurité familiale. Donc, aujourd'hui, comment intégrer les instruments temporaires dans la protection sociale, c'est tout simplement pour moi, lorsqu'un choc survient, de se penser à ces deux instruments essentiels. On peut imaginer que le programme de bourse puisse s'élargir en temps de choc et puisse se rétrécir donc, et reprendre sa dimension normale lorsque le choc sera dépassé. Et que la mise en place de mesures soit vraiment des cas exceptionnels, mais qu'on puisse utiliser vraiment ces systèmes de protection sociale parce que ils ont la capacité, comme je l'ai dit, c'est des amortisseurs sociaux. Donc, voilà un peu ce que je voulais partager avec vous en restant disponible. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Merci, Ousmane. That was a great overview of the many actions and programs that Senegal is tapping for countering the current crisis. Let's go to Frederic dos Santos in Cabo Verde. Frederic, over to you.
Bonjour, merci. Merci de nous avoir invités pour participer à cette rencontre. C'est un honneur pour nous de partager notre expérience. Je m'appelle Frédéric Dos Santos, donc de l'Institut national de la prévoyance sociale du Cap-Vert, l'organisme en fait qui gère le régime contributif de la sécurité sociale au Cap-Vert. Une petite contextualisation par rapport au pays. C'est un petit pays constitué de 10 îles, dont 9 habitées, à peu près un peu plus de 4000 km², environ 500 000 habitants. Au niveau de la protection sociale, le régime contributif couvre un peu plus de 50% des travailleurs du pays, y compris les fonctionnaires publics qui sont maintenant à l'INPS. Et environ 72% de la population âgée de plus de 60 ans a une pension, dont la moitié est couverte par le régime non contributif. Donc, c'est 36% pour le régime contributif et 36% pour le régime non contributif. Donc, pour répondre à la question des mesures de protection sociale que le gouvernement ou notre institution a mis en place pour répondre aux crises de la pandémie et aussi aux crises actuelles de l'inflation et des pénuries alimentaires et énergétiques, les mesures sont à peu près, disons, les mêmes que celles adoptées au Sénégal, disons à une échelle moindre. On parle de 17 millions d'habitants au Sénégal et 500 000 habitants au Cap-Vert. En fait, je ne vais pas insister sur les mesures sanitaires du programme de vaccination gratuite à l'aide de COVAX et des aides multilatérales et bilatérales. Au niveau de la crise socio-économique, les premières mesures qui ont été mises en place ont été celles des transferts d'argent, en fait. le gouvernement a adopté des prestations extraordinaires de protection sociale, notamment le RSO. Le RSO, c'est le revenu solidaire pour les travailleurs du secteur informel durant le premier confinement, qui a été prolongé après. Aussi, il y avait déjà une autre prestation non contributive qui s'appelait le RSI, le revenu social d'inclusion, donc qui a été adapté au revenu social d'inclusion d'émergence, pourtant pour les populations vulnérables en âge actif. Au niveau du secteur formel, donc couvert par l'INPS, il a été mis en place le layoff presque toute la durée de la pandémie, hein, d'avril 2020 à décembre 2021, où l'INPS, dans un premier moment, payait 35% du salaire du travailleur, et après, juste pour le secteur du tourisme, 45% en fait du salaire, et 25% étaient à la charge des entreprises. Il y a aussi eu la facilitation d'accès à l'allocation chômage.
No, I have it on this. You have it? Ah, okay, cool. I'm missing just 4 variables where I can't find the question.
Une interférence là. Okay. Donc, il y a eu la facilitation d'accès à l'allocation chômage aussi, qui a eu lieu dans le premier trimestre après la survenue de la pandémie. Et plus récemment, il y a eu des mesures de mise en place de tarifs sociaux sur l'électricité et l'eau. En fait, le Cap-Vert avait mis en place, avant la pandémie même, ce qu'on appelle ici le CSU, qui est le cadastre social unique, qui est équivalent, disons, au registre national unique dont a parlé mon collègue du Sénégal. Et ce cadastre social unique a permis, en fait, de faciliter la disponibilisation de toutes ces prestations et permis d'identifier aussi les populations vulnérables pour les faire bénéficier des tarifs sociaux d'électricité et d'eau qui vont jusqu'à parfois 50% de réduction de la facture. Et tout dernièrement, les autorités du pays ont mis en œuvre une mesure de réduction de la charge fiscale sur le lait et une politique de maintien des prix des céréales pour combattre donc l'inflation. La suppression aussi de certaines taxes sur le carburant et une politique de limitation de l'actualisation des prix sur le carburant jusqu'à 5%. Au Cap-Vert, l'actualisation des prix se fait mensuellement, dépendamment des cours du pétrole. Mais avec cette mesure, ça a permis de limiter en fait l'augmentation des prix. Le financement de ces mesures face au contexte de contraintes budgétaires a été fait basiquement basé sur le budget de l'État et des aides, certainement des partenaires traditionnels tels que les Nations Unies, l'Union européenne, la Banque mondiale et des partenaires bilatéraux, Luxembourg, Chine, États-Unis, France, Espagne, tous ces partenaires bilatéraux traditionnels du Cap-Vert. Le revenu solidaire, par exemple, a été entièrement financé par l'Union européenne, aux alentours de 2 millions d'euros. Pour la crise actuelle, les estimations du gouvernement montrent que le pays aura besoin d'environ 80 millions d'euros, environ 5% du PIB, pour la lutte contre les effets socio-économiques qui en découlent. Par rapport au système contributif, les mesures en place ont été financées par les contributions sociales à hauteur de 13 à 15% des contributions sociales perçues sur les 2 dernières années. En ce qui s'agit de la coordination entre le secteur de la protection sociale et le secteur humanitaire ou de la sécurité alimentaire pour améliorer les résultats en matière de sécurité alimentaire et de nutrition, le gouvernement du Cap-Vert, à travers le ministère en fait, de la Famille, d'inclusion et du développement social et de la FICAS, qui est la Fondation capverdienne d'action sociale scolaire, coordonne le programme d'action de sécurité alimentaire. Et la mise en place est faite avec l'appui des services municipaux, ainsi que des associations communautaires et de lutte contre l'insécurité alimentaire. Ainsi, le programme alimentaire a pu bénéficier à près de 30 000 ménages et près de 140 000 personnes, environ 30% en fait de la population du pays. Relativement à l'intégration de ces mesures dans le système national de protection sociale, je vais renforcer en fait les conclusions de mon collègue du Sénégal.
Frédéric, excusez-moi, I will need to ask to wrap up, please. We are already over time.
En fait, le CAVER avait déjà à sa disposition le cadastre social unique qui a permis d'identifier assez rapidement les populations cibles au niveau du non-contributif. Et ce maillage entre contributif et non contributif a permis assez rapidement, en un mois en fait, de procéder au transfert d'argent et d'identifier les populations cibles, même au niveau de la mise en place du programme de sécurité alimentaire, avec l'aide importante des services municipaux. Ils ont joué un rôle important au niveau de la logistique, en fait, pour faire parvenir à ces populations ces aides alimentaires. Au niveau des transferts d'argent, on a la chance au Cap-Vert d'avoir une population qui est pratiquement bancarisée. Presque tout le monde a un compte bancaire ici, donc ça s'est fait assez rapidement. Donc, je dirais que le cadre, renforcer en fait le cadre législatif de la protection sociale qu'on a en ce moment, entre le contributif et le non-contributif, et renforcer aussi le cadastre social unique permettra de faciliter, disons, la gestion de futures crises. Merci.
Thank you so much, Frédéric, for such a comprehensive overview of a system perspective of all the actions and important challenges that Cape Verde is facing. Let's go to Sarah Hunt for an Irish perspective on the crisis.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much, Ugo and colleagues, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here today to share experiences and exchange learning on Ireland's social protection approaches as a donor in response to the current overlapping crises, including our recent experience with the COVID-19 pandemic. Ireland's response to the COVID-19 pandemic built on our policy for international development, A Better World, but also Irish Aid's social protection strategy that had been in place for a number of years before that. And of course, we drew on our existing strengths and experience at global and mission level. We didn't change our focus. I mean, our focus is on strengthening social protection systems that protect people across the life cycle, as well as shock responsive systems that can mitigate against the negative impacts of shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also climate-related disasters and currently rising food insecurity. Our focus in social protection and in all our work is on reaching those furthest behind, in particular in fragile and crisis contexts. And again, in these situations, Ireland invests significantly in the building of resilience of communities. So overall, our COVID social protection response focused on three interrelated approaches. The first was to safeguard existing social protection systems and advocate for their expansion, to make them to make them shock responsive in both vertical and horizontal ways, to cater for the needs of the most vulnerable, including the elderly and women and girls. A second approach focused on prioritizing coordination across social protection and humanitarian interventions in fragile and humanitarian crisis contexts. And a third approach was focused on supports, adaptability, flexibility, and innovation, including during the recovery phase, to build back better social protection systems and to integrate climate and accountability mechanisms. Given the interconnectedness of the current global crisis, a coherent and system-wide international response is necessary, and Ireland uses our voice to advocate for this. And through our actions on the ground, we encourage joined-up coherent responses, encouraging the multilateral system to deliver as one. We also work with EU partners to maximise the coordination, coherence and effectiveness of our collective European Union response on the ground and in global fora. The momentum generated by the COVID-19 pandemic allowed us to scale up our support to social protection, especially in fragile environments. The challenge now is to sustain this and to turn this into something that can last. And Ireland in particular recognises the importance of evidence to inform these types of policies and programme building, and we do partner with research institutions for this. We also look in our global partnerships and participation in spaces for influencing around social protection to ensure that global level action is responsive to specific country needs based on each country's overall response plan, and help ensure that national systems are deployed and developed and resourced to respond to current crises. There are many lessons to draw on from the past and present crises, but some key ones that I'll flag include the need to prioritise mitigation measures and containment measures to weather the impact of the crisis on loss of income, deterioration of livelihoods, increased vulnerability to lifestyle risks. And this is in line with our commitment to reaching those furthest behind first. And it remains a priority even in the changed nature of the current crisis relating to food security and obviously inflationary pressures. We also recognise that the secondary impacts of crises are often greater than the primary impacts, particularly as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, in the effects on commodity prices, regional effects, cross-border challenges and markets. While we acted in the short term, it is important that we did not act focusing only on a short-term response. It's very important to bring in medium to long-term thinking into our immediate short-term plans for recovery. And a medium to long-term perspective is critical, as the gains made in recovery can be undermined by not having a recovery plan in place when the crisis ends or starts to abate. We learned as well from the pandemic that strong interinstitutional links between social protection and health in the COVID-19 response, as well as coordination with other areas, including food security and nutrition outcomes, are critical. And this has been even more important in the current context. We've also recognised that cash programming alone is not sufficient, and it needs to be complemented with other services in order for it to be transformative, to strengthen livelihoods and build resilience. And consideration, therefore, should always be given to cash plus approaches to think about livelihoods. And I think we'd also flag as well that it's very important not to confuse social protection with humanitarian assistance. And this is probably even more important in the current food security crisis. Social protection has high coverage but a low transfer, while humanitarian assistance tends to have lower coverage with a higher transfer. We need coordination between these responses. There are linkages possible, and there's many opportunities for a quick response using existing systems. And this sort of brings us right back to our systems-based approach, that if you can strengthen the systems for social protection, then they are there to respond to whatever the situation, whether it be to cover the gaps.
Excuse me, sir. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Sarah, sorry.
Sorry, I hope you could hear me okay there. But sorry, just going back to some of the gaps that were outlined by Michelle from the World Bank, social protection systems, without a systemic approach, it's very hard to address any of those gaps, whether they be in coverage, on financing, on delivery, or responding to shocks. I think with that, I'll leave it there for now and hand the floor back over to you, Ugo. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a fantastic overview. Let's move from Europe to Brazil and hear from Felipe some of the actions undertaken by the Brazilian government. Felipe, over to you.
Bonjour à tous. Tout d'abord, je voudrais vous remercier pour cette invitation qui me permet de partager avec vous l'expérience brésilienne de la location continue et ses actions intersectorielles. Donc, qu'est-ce que c'est la location continue? La location continue a été établie par la Constitution fédérale de 1988, est une prestation sociale qui garantit le versement de l'équivalent d'un salaire minimum aux personnes âgées de plus de 60 ans et aux personnes porteuses de handicap de tout âge pouvant justifier qu'elles ou leurs familles ne sont pas en mesure de subvenir à leurs besoins. Actuellement, on a 4,9 millions de personnes qui bénéficient de la location continue, parmi lesquelles 2,7 millions de personnes sont en situation de handicap et 2,2 millions de personnes sont personnes âgées. Et comment ça marche? La location continue? Afin de bénéficier de la prestation, les personnes porteuses de handicap ou les personnes âgées en situation de vulnérabilité qui ont un revenu familial par habitant égal ou inférieur au quart du salaire minimum doivent s'adresser au centre d'assistance sociale de leur commune et s'inscrire au registre unique des programmes sociaux du gouvernement fédéral. Le registre unique est un instrument qui identifie et caractérise les familles à faible revenu, permettant au gouvernement de mieux comprendre leur réalité socio-économique. Il est registre d'informations telles que les caractéristiques du ménage, l'identification de chaque personne, l'éducation, la situation professionnelle, le revenu, entre autres. Après s'inscrire au registre unique, les personnes doivent solliciter l'allocation continue à la sécurité sociale qui analyse le revenu. Les personnes porteuses de handicap doivent soumettre à une évaluation médico-sociale, c'est-à-dire une évaluation réalisée par un médecin expert et un assistant social. Et si les conditions sont remplies, les personnes commencent à recevoir la prestation du montant d'un salaire minimum et sont inclus et suivis par les services et programmes d'assistance sociale et d'autres politiques sociales. Cette année, le coût annuel de l'allocation continue a été d'environ 14 milliards de dollars, ce qui représente environ 95% du budget total de l'assistance sociale au Brésil. La gestion de l'allocation continue se partage entre le ministère de la Citoyenneté et l'Institut national de la sécurité sociale. Le ministère est responsable pour la coordination générale du financement, de l'accompagnement des bénéficiaires et de la gestion du registre unique, tandis que la sécurité sociale vérifie le revenu, effectue l'évaluation médicale et sociale, les paiements par virement bancaire et la réévaluation des critères tous les 2 ans. Comme précédemment mentionné, afin de recevoir l'allocation continue, le bénéficiaire potentiel et sa famille doivent s'inscrire au registre unique et déclarer, entre autres informations, les dépenses mensuelles avec certains éléments essentiels tels que l'électricité, l'eau, la nourriture, les transports, les gaz, les médicaments. Lors de l'analyse de ces données, une augmentation de 31,5% des dépenses en gaz en 2022 par rapport à l'année précédente a été constatée. Il est important de souligner qu'au Brésil, le gaz est surtout utilisé pour la cuisine, ce qui impacte directement la valeur du repas quotidien. Il s'agit du foyer de dépenses qui a le plus augmenté en pourcentage. Les dépenses en électricité ont également connu une augmentation cependant beaucoup plus faible, équivalente à celle liée à l'alimentation. Selon le registre unique, les familles dont membres perçoivent l'allocation continue dépensent en moyenne 81 $ par mois en alimentation, soit environ 36% de la valeur de la prestation. La quatrième foyer le plus important lié à l'alimentation, c'est le coût de l'eau utilisé pour l'hygiène, mais aussi pour boire et cuisiner. Par conséquent, quelles mesures de protection avons-nous pour faire face à une inflation toujours plus importante? Comme j'ai déjà évoqué tout à l'heure, la valeur de l'allocation continue est égale au salaire minimum, c'est-à-dire que lorsque le salaire minimum est ajusté, il y a des effets au réajustement automatique de la valeur de la prestation. Depuis 2019, le salaire minimum est réajusté en fonction de l'inflation de l'année précédente par l'indice national des prix aux consommateurs. Actuellement, la valeur du salaire minimum au Brésil est autour de 226 $, alors que l'année dernière, il était 205 $, soit une augmentation de 10,2% qui correspond au taux d'inflation. Et quelles mesures de protection face à la hausse du prix de l'électricité et du gaz on a mis au Brésil? Depuis 2002, le Brésil a voté une loi permettant aux personnes vulnérables de ne pas payer leurs factures d'électricité ou de leur octroyer une forte réduction. Les familles dont le revenu par personne est inférieur ou égal à la moitié du salaire minimum ou dont au moins un des membres bénéficie de l'allocation peuvent prétendre à une réduction de leur facture d'électricité comprise entre 10 et 65% du montant total. À partir de janvier de cette année, 2022, le bénéficiaire de l'allocation continue ont été automatiquement inclus dans le programme de tarification sociale de l'électricité. Autrement dit, le bénéficiaire de l'allocation continue n'ont plus besoin de s'inscrire personnellement auprès de compagnies d'énergie pour bénéficier de la réduction sur les factures d'électricité. Une autre mesure très importante, récente, c'est l'aide au gaz, un programme créé par le gouvernement fédéral en novembre 2021, qui a pour but de réduire les prix du gaz de cuisine pour les familles à faible revenu. Les publics cibles de ces programmes est constitué de familles qui reçoivent l'allocation continue en compte politique sociale. L'aide versée tous les 2 mois est du montant de 50% du prix de référence moyenne nationale de la bouteille de gaz. C'est ça, merci beaucoup de m'avoir écouté.
Thank you so much, Felipe. That was perfectly on time by the second. So we heard now from 4 governments, their perspectives, their experience, and we will now turn to 2 international organizations, and in particular 2 thought leaders in those institutions to hear their reflections on what they heard so far. And we start with Marco Nolis from FAO. Marco, over to you.
Thank you, Hugo, and thank you to the 4 presenters. So I have 4 main points of reflection, which are based on a mix of what I've been observing, including from the reports that the World Bank has been producing and from what I've heard just now. And these are organized around identifying the need for response, then identifying how to respond, who to reach, and how do we mobilize the financing to make this happen. So in terms of the need for the response, what I've observed is that responses have so far to the high food prices have so far been slow. Because prices already in August 2021, prices reached a 20-year high, and they were rising before that. So prices have begun to rise since the lifting of the first lockdowns. And the speed of the response is fundamental. If we're thinking of the poorest households that eat today, thanks to what the income that they earn today, when you see an increase in food prices, they don't have any savings to rely on. So the swiftness of response is fundamental. And here I think there's a need for informing the shock responsive of social protection systems with price information. I think what I'm seeing is that if shock responsive systems are informed, are triggered by information on climate shocks, climate-related shocks. But I think there's more to be done in terms of informing these systems through price information. We have been too slow this time around in responding to high food prices. The high food prices are not only since the start of the war in Ukraine. Yes, they increased, they spiked with the war in Ukraine, but they were very high before that. Then in terms of the need, in terms of how to respond, I think from all the presentations we've had, one thing I take away is the complexity of the responses, the different measures that have been implemented to reach different population groups. And this is very much from the social protection angle, naturally, since that's what we were asked to present on. But we need to see social protection as being part of a bigger whole, part of, in the case of food prices, being part of a food system, so understanding the interaction between different elements of the food systems. And so it's complex. Identifying which the most suitable responses. I think Mikhail earlier also hinted at identifying how also the agricultural sector can play a part in this. So this points for me to the need to firstly placing social protection at the heart of the overall responses to high food prices. In the longer term, placing social protection at the heart of development policies. And also getting prepared. There always going to be price shocks. Yeah. So we need to prepare on how to respond. We can't think about how we're going to respond once a shock comes. So contingency planning, thinking beforehand, before the shocks occur. How do we respond when there are high food prices? What is the role of the different sectors in doing so? And this is where it's fundamental to have those coordination mechanisms that bring together different actors, including from the humanitarian and the development sectors. Then who needs to be reached? And I really like the emphasis of the different presentations made on the importance of reaching those who are most vulnerable to food prices. We have all noticed, or everyone who's connected on this call, I'm sure, has noticed the increase in prices of food, energy, and so forth. But there are some people who are more vulnerable than others. So these are the people we have to reach first. And in all the country presentations, we heard about how there are information systems that help identify who needs to be reached, and these information systems also help us reach these people. It's important that these information systems are not too rigid. They're able to grasp, to catch the diversity of the population groups that are vulnerable to these shocks. So this includes also elements of interoperability between different information systems, for instance, social registries, farmer registries. I think the case of Brazil also brings in the health registries. So seeing the broader picture, not being too narrowly focused. And last but not all is financing. How do we make all this happen? In one of the World Bank reports, the last report, which is monitoring on the responses to the high food prices, what really struck me and causes concern to me is the fact that the rich countries have so far spent 10 times more than poor countries. So this, I think, these are countries that are, the richer countries are able to mobilize more resources. There's a financial crisis, poorer countries are even poorer than they were. So it's fundamental that the international IFIs play a role in helping developing countries mobilize the resources. We've also seen the cases of, I think, Senegal, and colleagues from Senegal and Cabo Verde mentioned the importance of blended financing. I think this is important. Mikhail referred to the importance of mobilizing national resources over the longer term. Yes, that's true. Also, the Global Accelerator emphasized the importance of this. But in the shorter term, it's fundamental to help these countries respond. So we need to avoid there being an increasing gap between the richer and the poorer countries. So let's leave no one behind. Over.
Thank you so much, Marco, for such comprehensive reflections. Let's move a little further north to Rome, getting to Florence. Dominic, over to you.
Thanks, Hugo. And I'll first start by saying that I really appreciate Marco's comments, and I agree with them all. I want to look at them from a slightly different perspective, or maybe in a little bit of a different order. As we look towards, what these, how social protection should respond to these crises, and we're living through multiple crises, and we really need to understand what's happening in terms of changes to risks in livelihoods. And the management of information systems are very important for that. But perhaps what I'm hearing less of is particular groups in populations. And naturally, you're going to hear me from UNICEF talk about children. And children are particularly high risk from increases to poverty, both through COVID and particularly through the Ukraine conflict. We estimated 100 million children, 117 million children pushed into poverty because of COVID. Our recent work on on Central Asia for the group of countries there in Eastern Europe was that of the 10 million people who are being pushed into poverty in the first 6 months of the Ukraine crisis, 4 million of them will be children. And that's children make up only 20% of the population, but 40% of the poverty risk. I think it speaks a little bit to the nature of the crises we're dealing with, and we need to sort of distinguish the attributes of the crises to help us understand, well, really what can we learn from COVID, or whether the COVID response was adequate, and what can we take to the inflation crisis. The COVID crisis, hit hard through employment and being able to, and markets, supply chains, as well as through health. The Ukraine crisis is affecting supply chains and prices of necessities, grain and fuel, which make up a larger proportion of the overall expenditures in low-income households, affecting them particularly, and affecting those with dependents particularly. So we could expect, it's interesting here, Brazil's response for the elderly. We can expect the crisis the inflation crisis to be hitting families pretty hard, particularly in the left-hand side of the income distribution. I agree with Marco that, and with others, I don't think the inflation response has met even close to the COVID response. We could see more urgency put in place and more innovation in responses to the inflation crisis. I don't know whether it's because COVID has restricted finance available to that, but controlling prices, waiving fees, as well as providing food packages, all of those things were used quite widely in COVID, and we've not seen that to the same degree. And the use of cash obviously has not been to the same degree. I'm listening to the Irish presentation and agreeing with almost everything I hear in terms of the need for the responses to be inclusive. I think we must also be thinking about, and this didn't happen so well in COVID, of the money that went to families to support them, or the money that went to people to support them, very rarely direct to children, often through employers, and often given to people who were already somehow registered in the system. They were already receiving a benefit, or they were already in employment. They kind of largely ignored the new poor, and they largely ignored people who are outside of the system. That goes towards extending income inequality within countries, to go on top of, as Marcos says, and I totally agree, extending income inequalities between countries. If there was no crisis at all, spending on children in high-income countries is already more than 10 times spending on children in low-income countries. And that's already driving inequality. And when you think about it, the population of the world has increased by 1 billion in the past 12 years. And all of these people have one thing in common. They're all under the age of 12. And our social protection on the youngest children, particularly in low-income countries, which amounts to, at least if you're under 6, you're only receiving about 6% of spending on children, is not helpful for building more equal societies in the future, and indeed moving from where we are to development. But we need to think as well about debt. COVID, there was a debt standstill initiative from G20 that was stopped after about a year. At the moment, 1 in 5 low middle income countries are spending more on debt servicing than they are on health, education, and social protection combined. Anyway, so the other thing I heard from the Irish presentation is we need to build on the momentum. For me, there seems to be some major systemic challenges ahead of us for making social protection work, both just generally and in response to crises. I'm not sure it's always helpful to distinguish social protection from adaptive social protection. We see systems where adaptive social protection is built into the system and it's responsive. We have issues with finances and debt. We need to improve management of information systems. Not every child is registered in every country. And we need to use the evidence base. Our work prior to, in the first 6 months of COVID, showed that social assistance, not social insurance, was the big ticket item. That's where you saw the protection of children's living conditions, family income, employment, staying in school. Social insurance did what it said it would do. It insured against certain things. And fiscal stimulus did a good job in maintaining family incomes. The big issue now is austerity. What we saw in the 90 countries we looked at, austerity was bad, bad, all the time, bad. And it would be a real catastrophe if we move from increasing inequality, systems that are not fully formed, not understanding how foreign assistance strengthens domestic social assistance, to go into a period of austerity, which in some countries we're already seeing, which I think is a major concern. So I hope I didn't go around the houses, but they're my reflections. Thanks, Hugo.
Thank you. Thank you. Very thought-provoking and insightful observations, Dominic. Thank you so much. So we have about half an hour, which is fantastic. We got a particular question for Usman on Senegal that I'll relay to him shortly. But I'd like also to pose perhaps a more general question to our speakers and discussants, and virtually all of you had touched upon the distinct COVID-related responses and inflation-related responses. And I'd like to perhaps hear from you what you see as main differences that are coming out in terms of responses to those two crises. And there is some debate out there or concern that the large-scale social protection responses in the current context may actually cause some inflation. And I'd like to just hear your views on contrasting the COVID and inflation responses and what your reactions and thoughts are about that. But as you think of that question, Usman, if you're there, I don't see your camera on, but if you're there, there is a question on whether you could please clarify your comment on the registry in Senegal, and in particular, to what kind of registry you were referring to, whether it's a single registry or the social registry, and whether you'd like to elaborate on that comment. So we start with Usman, and then we go to the other speakers, and to the audience, please feel free to ask any questions.
Merci Hugo et merci pour celui qui a posé la question. Je pense que pour le registre que nous avons, on l'appelle le registre national unique et il faut comprendre que initialement, c'était basé sur la pauvreté. Parce que l'idée, c'était qu'en 2013, quand on a mis en place le programme national de bourse de sécurité familiale, qui est un programme de cash transfert destiné aux populations pauvres, parce qu'il y avait de nouvelles autorités qui étaient arrivées en 2012, notamment le président Macky Sall, qui, dans sa campagne, avait fait le tour du Sénégal et avait été conscient de la demande sociale. Et conscient de la demande sociale, quand il est arrivé au pouvoir, il a pensé en fait qu'il fallait carrément orienter sa politique dans le domaine social. Et dans cette orientation de sa politique dans le domaine social, l'idée a été de mettre en place maintenant un cash transfert qui allait monter en puissance et pour couvrir toute la population qui était en extrême pauvreté, à l'époque estimée à 250 millions. Et donc, quand on a voulu mettre en place ce programme-là, il fallait un système de ciblage. Et la première année, on y est allé avec l'ANSD, qui est l'Institut de statistique, mais en faisant un ciblage d'abord communautaire, parce que l'ANSD avait les chiffres sur la pauvreté et savait au niveau de toutes les régions quel était le taux de pauvreté, qui était pauvre et combien il fallait au niveau de chaque région. Et donc, la première année, pour avoir les 50 000, nous avons donc fait ce ciblage-là. Et maintenant, en 2014, donc, est né le registre national unique. On a dit, pourquoi ne pas avoir un registre national où il y aurait l'ensemble de la population pauvre et vulnérable. Donc, et comme ça, on a bâti le registre national unique. Donc, c'est un registre où il y a l'ensemble de la population pauvre aujourd'hui au Sénégal. Donc, avec 3 systèmes de ciblage. Il y a ce qu'on appelle le ciblage géographique. Le ciblage géographique, c'est avec l'ANSD qui nous dit, en fonction de la carte de pauvreté, donc dans chaque région, combien de pauvres il y a. Et ensuite, au niveau de chaque région, maintenant, on fait ce qu'on appelle le ciblage communautaire, c'est-à-dire on constitue des comités autour des personnes influentes, c'est-à-dire les religieux, les hommes d'église, les leaders au niveau des femmes, les leaders au niveau des enfants, les délégués de quartier. Et ces personnes-là qui sont influents, donc, sont censés savoir qui était pauvre à leur niveau pour orienter un peu le programme. Et en ce moment, on fait le ciblage communautaire, donc on dresse une liste. Maintenant, pour s'assurer que voilà qui est pauvre, voilà qui n'est pas pauvre, donc l'ANSD revient maintenant pour faire un ciblage, pour faire un questionnaire, donc où il y a un ensemble de questions qui sont très corrélées donc à la pauvreté. Et à partir de ce moment, ces personnes sont enquêtées. Après, il y a
Usman, that That is so clear. Thank you so much. I think you provided an excellent.
De toute façon, il y aura une présentation demain sur ça et le directeur en question, c'est lui qui a développé en fait. Voilà. Merci beaucoup.
How handy. That's fantastic. Look forward to that presentation. If at some point, Felipe, you'd like also to reflect on this question of registries, you're most welcome to do so, since you also raised it in your remarks. So if you have anything to add on that point on single versus social registries, if you'd like to spend a minute on that question, that would be great. And then we also have a particular query for Sarah, and I'll get to you, Sarah, in a moment. Felipe, you have any remarks that you'd like to add on this issue?
Merci beaucoup, Hugo. Ce que je veux dire sur le registre unique au Brésil, c'est qu'il est né en 2001 et c'est un outil social important. C'est surtout pour tous les programmes du gouvernement fédéral, mais aussi il y a des programmes dans la municipalité, tu vois, et donc le gouvernement au niveau local peut faire des programmes de services spécifiques pour la population, par exemple indigène, autochtone et tout ça. Donc, c'est un outil très important pour l'assistance sociale, mais pas avec cet outil-là, on peut faire des programmes aussi pour des autres politiques sociales comme de la santé et tout ça. Et donc, c'est une présentation sur le registre unique que je peux faire après, mais c'est un bon débat à faire parce que c'est un outil très important pour la protection sociale au Brésil.
Thank you so much, Felipe. Maybe as part of the presentation that Usman mentioned tomorrow, there could be more room to discuss this important issue of registries. I had posed a question to you all, but now the audience is asking a number of questions, and I'd like to prioritize their questions to the one that I posed. So let's park the overarching question on differences between COVID and inflation for a moment. And there is a particular question for Sarah, and you mentioned the point that cash transfers are not enough by themselves, and whether you'd like to elaborate on that point, and if there are particular examples of more holistic approaches that you have seen in that regard.
Thanks, Hugo. I prepared an answer to the first question, so you're putting me on the spot a little bit here. But I suppose I would just say generally about Cash Plus in that for us, the social protection systems where they have had sort of the most, impact is about examining the whole of the family, the whole of the community, the whole of the life cycle, that, not just targeting income. So we've seen, obviously very positive impacts of social protection systems on girls going to school, and it's an indirect impact. It can often be hard to engineer, directly through the social protection system, but there is a lot of evidence that you can have these very positive outcomes. And obviously another key element in there is nutrition, particularly if social protection is being used as a method for responding to a food security crisis, and you've been emphasizing on reaching those who are most vulnerable. I think it was Marco that you said most vulnerable to changes in the prices of food. Well, nutrition is a key aspect in there, because it's about having a broader response than simply meeting a deficit at a particular point in time, but actually, again, looking at the life cycle, and particularly as well, I think going back to what Dominic was flagging children under the age of 5 and malnutrition, that this is a way in which, if you're really going to build up a community resilience, it's not just targeting, periodic or intermittent gaps in income, but actually about really thinking about how do you use a social protection system in a broader sense. response. So I'm not directly answering your question there in terms of providing examples, but that's, I'm just thinking of some of our work in Uganda, Malawi, and other areas that it's very much, we've had that integrated approach, and we've worked with different partners, including the ILO, about bringing those elements in, including as well, obviously, the productive employment elements of it, which is on another end of another dimension, I would say, of Cash Plus, as well, is really about thinking about making this sort of a productive investment as well in the community. But if you'll allow me just even to touch quickly on your other question around the difference in response, I mean, coming at it from a donor perspective, I suppose COVID was a very, very particular shock. It was a very new shock, at least for our generation. And it meant that you had a very broad scale response and an openness to scaling up social protection across the board, because it was just seen as a way of, again, reaching multiple goals at the same time, learning the lessons from Ebola in Sierra Leone, where that you had to have a focus on income and not just on health response if you were to keep, to protect the gains of all recent investments and development. And I would just say that sort of the current food security crisis is pronounced, it's acute, it's severe, it's having devastating impacts, but it's coming on top of other crises. Like it's been relentless. The Horn of Africa in particular, it's crisis upon crisis, and that brings a certain element of fatigue, a certain element of not really knowing if we have the tools to respond to that. And that social protection is clearly, and cash transfers are one element of that, but there's a bigger question around food systems transformation that has to be answered in there as well. And how do you integrate your response through social protection with a broader question around food systems transformation in a world that is dominated by conflict, which is obviously exacerbating all of these issues. So I would just think at a very macro level, that's quite a big difference between the kind of global response to this, which I think would necessarily then feed down into very differentiated responses within each country, particularly between low-income countries and middle-income countries. And just very quickly, I suppose we would sort of take the view that the cash transfers to the poorest and the poorest countries, they're very small. So talking about inflationary impact is some way nearly kind of a diversion from that. But I know that it's a very different question in middle-income countries where people are still terribly affected, but there are different macro issues going on. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. You responded basically to two combined questions. That's fantastic, giving a lot of perspective to both. I see that Shara has her hand raised, so let me go to her very quickly. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Ugo. I just want to thank all the colleagues. It was a very interesting and rich panel, and thank you for moderating it so well. You know, I didn't hear, but maybe I missed it, but I didn't hear anyone mention anything about the way in which we make sure in an inflationary context that the adequacy of benefits is maintained, of social protection benefits. You know, we did a kind of quick count through our World Social Protection Database, and we find that out of 343 social security schemes that we have data on, more than half of them, about 182, had no specific adjustment rule to changes in the cost of living. So basically more than half don't do this indexation that, according to our standards, you're supposed to maintain the adequacy of benefits by either, you know, establishing rules that adjust the benefits to inflation or to the real wages or to a mix of inflation and real wages. So this seems to me like an important point in a context where we have this cost of living crisis, that our benefit levels are being eroded. And in, you know, more than half of our schemes, you know, we don't have mechanisms for indexation. So I'd just like to request anyone who'd like to comment on this to sort of reflect on it. Does it seem like an important point? It seems to me like it may be an important point to think about. Thank you.
Another important point is a crucial point. Thank you so much, Shara, for raising this important issue of indexation. Any of the speakers, I kind of saw Dom raising his physical hand. Right, Dom, let's start with you, and then let's see if others would like to chime in.
Thanks, Hugo. I think it's critical. Picking up on what Sarah was saying, what Shara was saying, in many cases, these benefits don't amount to a great deal of GDP overall. And I think it's somewhat of a distraction to link it then to inflation. And if you take away indexing, or you weren't to index these benefits, then you're taking away their main purpose, which is to meet living standards. In fact, you're undermining the main goal. They're not going to evaluate well. And we're going to get into that old trap of social protection being cut, evaluating less well, being cut further, and it's not good news. The other thing is, I do think that we should bear in mind there's other mechanisms rather than just indexing. There's a number of countries that use minimum living standards, or they pay their benefits or eligibility benefits to a national formula. And that formula includes the prices of various goods and items. But they're often a black box, so we don't see what's in there. And so you can't really recommend how they might be managed. And the timeliness, which goes to Marco's point, the timeliness of the indexation or the adjustment to the minimum living standard is really important. We started 6 months ago with food inflation at 5 or something like this. We're up to 11 in some, 12 or more in some places. This is accumulating all of the time. So you can't just mark it up by 11 now because it's something bigger than that. I really think we should be pretty much one voice with benefit indexation, recognizing that it's an attribute of a successful social protection system. And if we're going to manage inflation, we should do it through other means, which could also be equally beneficial, like purchasing en masse particular, necessities or gifting goods, whatever you want to call them, or price regulation. Don't want to talk too much. Thanks, Hugo.
That's great, Dom, and I think that Chakra's great comment ties also to what Marco was saying in ensuring that there are early warning systems that track the evolution of prices and that they are automatically adjusted. So there is a big agenda, I think, here in a very on making the preparedness agenda very concrete. And I would welcome any views that you may have on this point. Let me also flag that there is another question from the audience, and just to summarize it, it's basically about social insurance, and what do you see as the role of contributory insurance in ensuring food and income security in times of crisis? We talk a lot about social assistance. Do you see any role for social insurance? Another big question to reflect on. Maybe Sasha would like to chime in and solve this puzzle.
I have a question actually for Frédéric, and I'm going to ask my question in French. Frédéric, vous avez mentionné dans l'exemple du Cap-Vert, en fait, que le Cap-Vert a mis en place en fait des réductions d'impôts, et j'ai cru comprendre des subventions pour justement répondre aux problèmes de hausse des prix. Ce sont des programmes qui sont développés de manière temporaire. Est-ce que vous pouvez un petit peu expliquer du coup l'approche du Cap-Vert, parce que je crois qu'elle est intéressante et à la fois différente de ce qu'on a pu entendre de la part du Brésil et du Sénégal, qui ont du coup plutôt renforcé en fait les systèmes de transfert aux populations qui étaient les plus impactées. Du coup, est-ce que vous pouvez revenir un petit peu sur le cas du Cap-Vert par rapport à ça? Merci.
Merci. En fait, comme je l'ai dit, avant même la pandémie, il y a eu des mesures qui ont été mises en place et qui ont été possibles grâce au registre social unique. Par exemple, la réduction des taux au niveau la réduction au niveau des factures en fait, d'électricité et d'eau, par exemple, qu'on appelle ici tarif social d'électricité et d'eau, qui peuvent aller entre 30 et 50%. Après, plus récemment encore, au niveau de la crise de l'inflation, certaines taxes en fait ont été supprimées carrément au niveau sur le carburant, ce qui a permis en fait de limiter les dégâts, disons. Au niveau, ça c'est surtout pour la crise de l'inflation, aussi certaines taxes au niveau du lait et des céréales aussi, qui ont été subventionnées. Surtout sur les céréales, le lait, en fait, c'est carrément une réduction des taxes du TVA. sur le lait qui a été carrément supprimé. Et surtout au niveau des, c'est des biens en fait de première nécessité, les céréales ici, j'imagine partout. Et donc, ça a été des mesures sur ce plan temporaire, juste pour cette crise inflationniste. Mais au niveau des tarifs sociaux, c'est un programme qui existait déjà et qui a été renforcé avec cette crise. Merci.
Thank you, Frederic, for your response to that important question raised by Sasha. Marco, you raise your hand.
Yes, we'll get back to the point on indexing. Yeah. So that's fundamental, the indexing. Let's not lose sight of the fact that very few transfers are currently adequate, even before the rise in food prices. For instance, in rural areas, in low-income countries, the value of a transfer is 0.3 cents of a dollar per capita per day. The cost of a healthy diet in 2020, so before the rise in food prices, was $3.5 a day. So there's a huge gap, right, between the cost of a healthy diet and the value of transfers that households are receiving. And so yes, indexing fundamental, but even let's think of throughout the year, throughout time, it's important to ensure the adequacy, irrespective of increasing food prices. Then on the question you posed on inflation, I wish social cash transfers, social protection responses were causing inflation, because it would mean that they're being effective in increasing consumption. But both the breadth of these programs, the number of people that these programs are reaching, and the value of the transfers that they're providing is not sufficient to increase demand by so much as to cause inflation. And where there is that risk, I think this points to what I was saying earlier, it's the importance of seeing social protection as a response amid a plethora of other responses, including supply side responses. Over.
Thank you, Marco. Frederic and Usman, you raised both your hands. Let's go for like 20 seconds each before we turn to another question.
Merci. Par rapport aux questions qui ont été posées, est-ce que c'est les mêmes mesures? En quoi les interventions pour faire face à l'inflation devaient différer des interventions face à la COVID? Voilà. Bon, pour moi, la COVID, c'est une réflexion. Hein? La COVID était plus vaste, elle touchait tout le monde et avait plusieurs champs d'action, notamment sanitaires, financières, etc. Et de ce point de vue-là, moi, je pense que les interventions face à la COVID étaient plus vastes parce que tout le monde était impacté d'une façon ou d'une autre. C'est vrai, l'inflation, par contre, touche tout le monde. Mais comme c'est la hausse des prix, on voit que souvent, ceux qui sont les plus impactés, c'est les catégories les plus pauvres parce que c'est eux qui ont une part plus importante à réserver à la consommation. Et de ce point de vue, nous, pays africains, qui n'avons pas suffisamment de ressources et qui devons faire face à plusieurs types donc, de dépenses, je pense qu'à ce niveau-là, le ciblage est important. C'est pourquoi la question des registres nationaux ou des registres sociaux est importante à ce niveau-là. Et mieux, c'est pourquoi nous, au début, on avait fondé le registre national autour de la pauvreté, mais aujourd'hui, on est en train de le faire passer à l'échelle en essayant de capter les classes moyennes parce qu'on a vu que dans ce genre de crise, si on se limite seulement aux populations pauvres, donc l'impact n'est pas très ça. Donc, on a un meilleur impact quand on va à la pauvreté, mais aussi à la classe moyenne, parce que la classe moyenne aussi est impactée. Maintenant, le rôle de l'assurance sociale pendant la crise, moi, je vais peut-être reformuler la question. Comment on peut faire développer l'assurance sociale pour qu'en cas de crise, l'État puisse intervenir le moins possible? Parce que souvent, les interventions de l'État en cas de crise sont très importantes durant la COVID. C'est parce que tout simplement, il y avait un déficit de l'assurance sociale. Par exemple, dans nos économies, nous avons des économies où l'informel est très vaste. Et de ce point de vue, c'est des personnes qui ne sont pas couvertes par l'assurance sociale. Alors, maintenant, comment faire en sorte que cette assurance sociale soit le plus
that is a great point. I think we could have an entire event on that beautifully phrased question that you just made. I think this is really an important point on how to use insurance in a more effective way in crisis. Let me go to Frederic very quick because we have 4 minutes left, and I'd like to hear a final reflection from each of the speakers. Frederic, over to you.
Merci. Très rapidement, je voulais juste réagir par rapport à l'élargissement de l'espace fiscal, de l'espace budgétaire de la protection sociale à moyen et long terme, et rebondir un peu aussi sur la conclusion de mon collègue Ousmane, de cette nécessité de renforcer l'assurance sociale. Comme je l'ai dit tantôt, on a une des mesures, c'est l'élargissement en fait de la protection sociale contributive, de l'assurance sociale. Au Cap-Vert, on a un peu plus de 50% des travailleurs qui sont dans le système. Il faudrait faire des efforts pour aller plus loin. Une autre mesure que je trouve très importante, c'est au niveau de la dette. Spécifiquement au niveau du Cap-Vert, on a à peu près une dette qui est évaluée à plus de 130% du PIB et un service de la dette qui est là, l'année dernière, à près de 90% du PIB et qui peut augmenter aussi après les moratoires qui ont été donnés l'année prochaine. Donc, la restructuration de la dette des pays pauvres, je trouve que ce sera une piste très importante au niveau de cette thématique, de cette problématique. Merci.
Thank you. And Frederic, since you just had the mic, let me start with you. We have 3 minutes left, and I'd like each of the speakers to reflect on which, in your view, has been the most important lesson for social protection that has been learned over the past couple of years, whether it's a COVID response or the current inflation response. Frederic, in your view, what's the most important takeaway from these past couple of years?
Les crises récentes dans nos pays qui n'ont pas encore, disons, cette maturité au niveau de la protection sociale, ont montré l'importance en fait d'une protection sociale solide. On a pu réagir assez rapidement, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, parce qu'au niveau contributif, on avait un système bien en place, aussi bien administratif et une bonne base financière, parce que c'est un système assez jeune, donc on a encore assez de réserves. Et au niveau du non-contributif, la mise en place du cadastre social unique, du registre social unique, a permis à l'État d'aller très vite. Comme je l'ai dit tantôt, en 1 mois, on a mis en place ces mécanismes de transfert d'argent. Donc, renforcement de la protection sociale. Merci.
Thank you so much, Frederic. Almost like a live case study for the question on the role of social insurance. Sarah, the single most important lesson over the past couple of years, 20 seconds.
Oui, merci. C'est à moi?
I asked Sarah. Sarah
okay.
Hunt. Sarah, can you hear us? Not sure if the audio looks functioning there. Maybe let me go to Felipe.
Et pour moi, la leçon la plus importante pour la protection sociale brésilienne face au COVID-19 a été la preuve de l'importance d'un réseau de protection sociale bien structuré, basé sur l'information et basé sur un modèle de gestion participative et décentralisé entre l'Union, les États, les municipalités et le district fédéral. Le registre unique s'est avéré être un outil essentiel pour une réponse rapide aux familles vulnérables. Les programmes de transfert de revenus d'urgence et les prestations d'assistance, telles que l'allocation continue, se sont avérés essentiels pour garantir l'accès à la nourriture et s'assurer que les besoins de première nécessité sont comblés, ceci face à l'inflation toujours plus importante. C'est ça.
Thank you so much, Felipe. Sarah, I'll come back to you as last. I'll give you the final word to the panel. So let me go to Dom. Key question over the past couple of years.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I was just struggling with unmute. So for me, I think the narrative of social protection for development needs to change. Take a look at how much a G7 country spends on social protection and of its entire portfolio, and how it's used in stabilizing the economy, and how it's used for growth, and how it's used to meet basic rights. And then compare this to the 1.4 billion children that don't get to see any social protection at all, and the poverty risks they see. Because each G7 country, perhaps with the exception of the US, is spending more on social protection than health and education combined. And that should be a wake-up call for how we speak to countries that are developing their systems, their comprehensive systems, in terms of what we expect from social protection. Thanks.
That was very powerful. Thank you so much, Dominic. Antoine, I hope you'll bear with us if we are a couple of minutes late. We started a little later as well. Let me go to Usman, 20 seconds before going to Marco. Usman.
OK. 20 secondes pour dire qu'effectivement, la leçon à tirer, c'est qu'on a compris que la protection sociale est un amortisseur social. Et que, comme je l'ai dit dans mon intervention, c'est que dans le cas d'espèce, il faut faire jouer aux instruments de protection sociale leur rôle. Par exemple, le registre social, comme l'a dit mon collègue du Cap-Vert, est important. C'est-à-dire aujourd'hui, on ne doit plus se limiter à un registre qui se limite à la pauvreté, mais qui va jusqu'à la classe moyenne et même voir toute la population. Maintenant, les transferts monétaires aussi sont importants. C'est-à-dire que nos pays tous ont au moins un programme de transfert monétaire. Maintenant, il faut travailler à la flexibilité de ce programme-là pour que lorsque le choc arrive, on puisse l'élargir pour toucher tous ceux qui sont censés être dans le besoin. Et lorsque la crise sera amoindrie, maintenant, de faire reprendre le programme sa dimension normale. Donc, voilà un peu.
Merci. Oh, I'm on, but I don't talk, so don't worry. I have this whole...
Florian, your mic is on. If you could please unmute. Thank you so much. Thank you, Usman. Your points were loud and clear, including the importance of flexibility. Thank you so much. Marco, before going to and finishing up with Sarah.
I'll piggyback on what Dominic said, to massively and rapidly invest in expanding the coverage of social protection systems. And as there's increasing awareness of the need to expand the coverage of these systems in urban areas, we must not forget rural areas, which is where 84% of the extreme poor are concentrated.
Short and powerful as well. Thank you very much, Marco. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. And very quickly, I suppose the major lesson from COVID-19, social protection matters, it works.
Ouch, unfortunately, the connection is not that great.
Things, but it's not a magic bullet. It can't just do things, and you need to make sure you're targeting the right thing. No, apologies.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. The connection was not great, but I think we got the general sense of the point that it's not just about cash transfers and social protection. There is much more to it. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone, all our speakers, our panelists, discussants, and all of you for the questions. The fact that they keep pouring in, I think, is a fitting testament to the exciting nature of the conversation. And thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Antoine. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Hugo, and thank you so much, everyone, for this very insightful discussions. We had the opportunity here to discuss possibly the most urgent crisis at the moment, the dramatic increase in energy and food prices. Now, in the next session, we'll move to a somewhat more permanent and long-term challenge, environmental degradation, climate change, and the role of social protection in tackling it. So we'll be back at 3 p.m. Paris time in 10 minutes. Looking forward to seeing you all again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Merci à tous. Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. Bienvenue à tous à nouveau. We'll go now to our second session on social protection and environmental degradation. Technical details are in the chat, and I will now introduce you to this session's moderator, Martin Denis, who is policy advisor at the Trade Union Advisory Committee, TUAC, at the OECD. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Antoine, and good day to you all, colleagues, dear friends. My name is Martin, as Antoine just said. I'm thrilled to be joining you today to moderate this panel. I'll be very brief as a matter of introduction. We all know the urgency and the importance of the topic we're going to discuss today. The world has gone through record high temperatures over the past few months. And climate-related disasters, droughts, and floods are simply multiplying. As we just exited the COP27 a few weeks ago. So I'm sure there's no need for me to underline the critical importance of this topic and the urgency of engaging collectively, much more decisively, and much more rapidly in the ecological transition. The OECD has shown that without proper mitigation policies, this trend might push between approximately 30 and 130 million people into poverty by 2030, that is tomorrow. This will, as we all know, disproportionately impact middle and low-income countries, and within those countries, those that have low incomes and low-income households. So therefore, it's not only a matter of environmental justice, it's a matter of redistributive policies and a matter of reducing inequalities. It's also about implementing what we call within the labor movement, the just transition. That is a transition that truly leaves no one behind, including through social protection. And this is where social protection is key. We often say that investing in social protection is not only the fair and right thing to do, we also say that it is actually the most pragmatic and efficient one from an economic and political standpoint, including because it strengthens social cohesion and the political support to the public policies, the public environmental policies that government implement. So let's try to have a closer look at this assertion. What are we really referring to when we talk about social protection systems? Can social protection reduce the effect of environmental damages to vulnerable populations? And which are the programs that have been most effective? Today, we'll have the chance to hear from distinguished panelists from different regions of the world and different backgrounds. We will first hear from country representatives from Bangladesh and Zambia. I see that they are connected to tell us more about what they do and what are the challenges that they face in their countries. And then we will try to look at the big picture. And thanks to our guest speakers and representatives of AFD, WFP, and the ILO, we'll try to look at some of the global challenges faced in delivering access to social protection to shelter populations from climate change and degradation. Each of our speakers will be interviewed for 7 minutes. And then again, just like for session one, we'll turn to you, the audience, for a round of questions and comments. Please use your raised hand button if you want to take the floor. Please also write any questions you may have in the chat box, and we'll make sure we convey them to the speaker. One last housekeeping rule, please make sure your microphone is off. And that you turn it on only when you take the floor. Please also turn off interpretation, which is in French or English, when you take the floor. And this is also for our speakers. So without further ado, let me turn to our first panelist today, Mohammad Nazmul Hassan. You are the Deputy Secretary of the Ministry of Social Welfare in Bangladesh. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mohammad. Your country is directly and very severely impacted by climate change, although it is a small contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And when we met to prepare this panel, you gave us an overview of some of the programs your country is implementing. Could you tell us more about what your country does to shield populations through social protection? What are the initiatives that are being implemented, and what are the challenges that you face looking ahead? The floor is yours, Mohammad.
Martin Danny. So welcome everybody. I'm so glad having me here. So today we'll discuss on the shielding population from environmental degradation and climate shocks, the most important contemporary issues. International community already makes some consensus on the role of a social protection system, and it is echoed in the core international frameworks like the SDG, Sendai frameworks, and moreover, social protection plays a crucial role in achieving 11 out of the 17 SDGs in combating the extreme events and aiding sustainable development. Even COP27 has also highlighted the role of social protection programs for climate vulnerable population. Human is the center of all activities in our country, like Bangladesh and other countries too. In Bangladesh, most of the cases, the vulnerable communities are the marginal poor who depends on the common natural resources, and they explore and exploit the nature without sense of sustainability. They live for today, not for tomorrow. So we all know that self-preservation is the first law of nature. So we try to meet the daily needs of the marginal poor, and our government provides food, house, medical support, and universal education for all. This alters their focus and award them as well for natural resource conservation. Furthermore, the climate change also deadly affect the communities in different ways. A social safety net also assists them to cope with the adverse situation. And you already uttered that Bangladesh only contributes 0.56% of the global emission, but we suffer most. Our government allocates more than $480 million to implement various climate-related projects. The IPCC reports projects that Bangladesh will experience an increasing in poverty 15% by 2030. Our constitution has clear provision for social security for its citizens. We now adopted life cycle-based massive program under the leadership of Honorable Prime Minister. We try to expanding the social safety net coverage every year. Now budget allocation increases 8-fold compared to the allocation of fiscal year 2008 and 2009. And Bangladesh government implement National Social Security Strategy Plan 2021-26. And disaster-prone areas, especially the vulnerable people, is getting the priority in that situation. So this disaster-prone includes the climate change affected peoples too. Bangladesh historically provides food rations and post-disaster relief for public safety net. Now, over the time, we graduated to a mainstream social and development concern. It is very difficult to select some projects, as you asked me, that have been most effective in the mitigating the poverty in the face of environmental degradation and climate shocks. It is a joint effort of many programs from different ministries and development. Like to save the natural fish stock, we introduced ban on fishing during breeding season. Minister of Fisheries and Livestock has their own program to support the marginal fishermen during the lean season. However, Minister of Social Welfare also provides allowances to the poor that also contribute them. Besides, Minister of Youth and Sports also have training program for the youth. They provide grant as well. So a joint effort which save poor and save nature accordingly is necessary. Bangladesh has been emphasized the importance of climate-informed planning, scalable support and covers appropriate financial mechanism and strengthening institutional capacity for adapting social protection programs and system to climate change. So social safety net expansion or climate shock specific approach is not a panacea to solve the multidimensional and very complex situation in our country. It needs a blending of all approaches. It should be needed to expand the social safety net, and area-specific and vulnerability context-specific activities should be needed to take into account. And for example, if we expand our social safety net to the coastal area in terms of cash transfer without taking coping strategy, it might work for short term, but fails in the long run. So in the final remarks, we can remind you all that a pre-funding safety net is one of the best alternatives to cope with adverse situation due to climate change. Along with that, physical and human capital should be given priority, a complement. Last but not least, I would like to utter the same voice with our Honorable Prime Minister. Please implement the last year promises of COP26 at Glasgow, exploring the nexus of social protection, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation in fostering strong linkages, breaking the silos, capitalizing the system, and bringing synergies in reducing overlapping vulnerability is also necessary. So I try to give a overall picture within these 7 minutes, but I'm not sure whether it is cover everything. So thank you for your patience hearing. Martin.
Thank you very much for this very rich and very informative insight and overview of the programs that are being undertaken. And I note from your intervention, amongst many things, that programs that are being implemented are joint efforts of various ministries. And I think we'll have the opportunity at a later stage to discuss this whole of government approach and this policy coherence dimension of implementing a social protection system to tackle the climate change and degradation and its consequences. You've also talked about the commitments that were made at the COP27 in Glasgow, and we'll again have, I hope, the opportunity to discuss the, let's say, global solidarity dimension of the topic we're discussing today when we invite our representatives of international organizations and the AFD. Thanks again, and we'll come back to you later during the discussions. Let me now turn to our second panelist, Anna Maria Chitembo-Chunga. You are the National Coordinator of the Zambia Pilot Program for Climate Resilience at the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment in Zambia. Thank you so much for being with us today. I will ask you a similar question. Could you briefly describe your key program and or intervention? What are the main challenges you're facing, and how can, in your view, social protection facilitate a just transition to environmentally sustainable economies and societies? The floor is yours, Anna Maria.
Thank you very much. And I'll write on the protocols already said in this meeting, just to share what we've been going through in Zambia regarding the nexus between climate change and social protection. I'll start from the apex. The Zambian government does continue to recognize and acknowledge the negative impacts of climate change on its population and also on the global population. And that's why in the 8th National Development Plan, currently running from 2022 to 2026, the government has indicated that Zambia will continue facing threats to its environment, including pollution, degradation of soil and landscapes. And mainly these are driven by deforestation, unsustainable wildlife poaching, and largely the effects of other climatic shocks. So having recognized this, these impacts of climate change, such as droughts, floods, and extreme temperatures, have increased in frequency and intensity. Currently, we should have had a very good rain season, which should have kicked off by now in Zambia. That is the norm we grew up in, but we are yet to start having adequate rains to talk about. That is already showing us that the impact of climate change on natural environment is so real and is so huge that we need to address it. So that makes the government's main response on climate change to focus on adaptation and mitigation through building resilience to the long-term impacts of climate change by promoting climate smart development pathways. So this is enshrined in the National Development Plan and also its Vision 2030. So how does the government do this? It has set up a robust institutional framework where we have the Council of Ministers on Climate Change, headed by the Republican Vice President. And this is enshrined in Zambia's National Policy on Climate Change of 2016, so that we respond as a country and manage climate change in a more sectoral and integrated manner. And in the Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Republican President, it's very important for our discussion now to recognize that the ministers that are responsible for health, ministers responsible for community development and social services, and the ministers of labor and social security are part and parcel of this Council of Ministers. Definitely because the effects of climate change also deal with effects of how do we respond to social protection. Then to support the Council of Ministers, we have the permanent secretaries who also are drawn to the various line ministries that sit on the Council of Ministers. And we have a technical committee. On the technical committee of climate change, it's very important to highlight that now this expands the technical expertise beyond government systems. It draws from the academia, it draws from civil service, it draws from the private sector to be part and parcel of the discussions on climate change and how we better respond. Last year, when government changed, we did have a new Ministry of Green Economy to be created, where we are residing. A very important milestone to address climate change issues, because this particular ministry now has been given the authority to coordinate all climate change issues, responding to climate change. And the implementation remains in the relevant government ministries. So it's important that we have one entry place where we discuss climate change issues, but the implementation goes ahead in relevant government line ministries and all. Then at provincial and district level, we have similar institutions that can look at climate change, and these do the implementation, and the PPCR did work through them, such as the District Development Coordinating Committee. So the structures are critical for Zambia to better respond, to ensuring coordination, targeted response, and resource mobilization, and correct allocation of resources. Yeah, so I will give an example of the pilot program for climate resilience, which Zambia has been implementing in the Barose and Kafue South Basin for the past 10 years. So it's a decade of implementation on climate change, aimed at improving adaptive capacity for vulnerable communities to climate change, including national institutional strengthening. So what have we learned over the past 10 years in implementing this program? We've reached close to 853,878 beneficiaries who represent 182,739 households. And the PPCR addresses health, water, and income poverty. And that for communities to address climatic shocks. So these are critical for the PPCR program. And it also promotes access to information on climate change, which improves one's decision-making at community level and ward level, and also at household level. How do I better respond to climatic shocks when they happen? How do I avoid them? How do I adapt? So we build resilient communities by providing alternative livelihoods in agro-related, forestry, water, resilient infrastructure, quite a number of issues: business, market access, provision of services, financial literacy, cooperative and group governance issues, weather index insurance, and how it works. So we give all this information, or training communities, or give them small grants to do that. Smart agricultural practices, and also improving market access. The issue of access to information remains very central to what we do and what we've been doing over the past 10 years. Then, building on the PPCR, the government is also implementing the Transforming Landscapes for Resilience and Development project in the northern part of Zambia, and promotes farmer-driven natural regeneration and community forest management of indigenous forests. So what the project does is to bring to the communities and the farmers the technical capacity to manage or restore degraded lands or ecosystems, and fosters community cohesion as they protect public or common forests, which is for their own good. And then they can get firewood, medicines, they can sell some of the logs to fell, but in a manner that benefits the community that is surrounding these communities. So through these projects, communities are able to undertake ventures such as ecotourism, as they embark on ranching, honey processing, from apiculture, sustainable caterpillar harvesting, to mention but a few. They can go into fish farming, so that they do learn to live away from unsustainable, relying on natural resources. Of course, the program looks good as I speak. It sounds very good. It has its own challenges as we've been working. And one of the major challenges has been the climate-related interventions in Zambia are not yet clearly linked to social protection, as interventions happen in parallel, even within same communities. I'm going to explain what that means. We don't have a deliberate action to coordinate climate-related interventions to social protection, both at national level and
think we've just lost you, Ana Maria. Can you hear us? Perhaps. No, I think you're muted and your camera is off. We might come back to you. Perhaps you can try to reconnect and rejoin us, and we'll come back to you afterwards if that's okay. Yeah, we'll come back to you immediately when you come back, Ana Maria. But thanks a lot for this intervention. There's a lot to recap here. You talked about the empowerment of people and communities in this new context, and you were just discussing just a moment ago and very openly acknowledging the fact that there is no obvious link between social protection and climate mitigation policies. And that's one of the challenges that you are dealing with. And we'll be happy to hear you further on this when you get back. You also discussed something that is actually critical, that is at the heart of the problem, or at least at the heart of the equation, is resource mobilization. To support social protection systems and environmental policies, redistributive policies, countries need fiscal space and need domestic resource mobilization, sometimes complemented by external development assistance. So let me now turn to our next speaker, Carlos Soto Iguaran. You are the task team leader at the Agence Française de Développement, the French national agency in charge of development assistance. And as I just said, one of the key challenges that countries may face in building climate response and social protection system is obviously the lack of fiscal space and available resources, basically. So we know that AFD provides loans and grants to support development programs throughout the world. A large part of the projects do support the ecological transition, climate adaptation and mitigation, and an increasing share of AFD projects also include support to social protection systems and programs. You have personally been active in countries like Colombia, but also other countries, and we are glad to have you with us today to perhaps share a bit more with us some of the experience of AFD in dealing with social protection as a tool to facilitate the just transition. Carlos, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Martin. Merci. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Je voudrais en effet d'abord mettre l'accent sur le fait que la protection et le changement climatique est au cœur des activités de l'AFD, y compris le secteur de la protection sociale, et que l'AFD, c'est une des premières institutions financières qui a pris en compte le climat dans ses activités, dans sa stratégie. Et depuis 2015, on met en œuvre des principes de comptabilisation de la finance climat avec un objectif de 50% de nos financements doivent contribuer à l'atténuation ou à l'adaptation, des objectifs qui sont encore plus ambitieux dans des géographies comme l'Asie ou l'Amérique latine. Donc, on considère à l'AFD que la protection sociale est un outil politique important pour faire face aux risques sociaux, y compris les risques associés au changement climatique. On sait tous autour de cette table que la protection sociale est clé pour répondre en période de crise sociale et économique. On l'a vu plus récemment avec le Covid. Et qu'avec le changement climatique, il est essentiel de protéger les personnes à travers à la fois l'assurance sociale, mais également l'assistance contre les conséquences que ce soit en matière de pauvreté, d'inégalité, de santé. Et nous préparons en ce moment un nouveau cadre stratégique 2023-2027 de santé et protection sociale avec une double approche. Il y a d'une part l'adaptation, donc tout ce qui est lié à la mise en œuvre de protection sociale adaptative pour protéger les personnes avant, pendant et après les chocs et renforcer la durabilité et la résilience des systèmes de protection sociale pour assurer la continuité des services et des prestations pendant les crises. En termes d'atténuation, il y a le volet ou la dimension juste de la transition énergétique. On va revenir sur ce point sûrement dans la discussion. Il y a la réduction de l'empreinte carbone des organismes de protection sociale et aussi la promotion de mesures de conservation de l'environnement, de la biodiversité à travers des travaux publics ou des services environnementaux. Donc, ce cadre nous donne un peu l'intervention et les financements, la mobilisation de ressources de l'AFD, que ce soit à travers des investissements, des financements budgétaires ou de l'assistance technique. Important de signaler que cet agenda, pour faire avancer cet agenda, plusieurs défis existent et j'en mentionnerai que deux. D'une part, il y a l'absence de sensibilisation du rôle que peut jouer la protection sociale à l'adaptation au changement climatique. Donc, on observe que dans certains pays, les stratégies de protection sociale, elles reconnaissent bien que les chocs climatiques sont des facteurs de vulnérabilité, mais il n'y a pas une traduction automatique dans la mise en œuvre des programmes ou de politiques. Et de manière similaire, les agences nationales en charge des investissements liés au climat n'intègrent pas ou peu la protection sociale pour soutenir des actions d'atténuation ou d'adaptation. Et ça se reflète dans le contenu des indices ou des plans nationaux d'adaptation. Donc, il y a un travail non seulement de mobilisation de ressources, mais aussi de plaidoyer, de renforcer la connaissance, de former les différents acteurs. Et un deuxième défi, je ne vais pas m'étendre, mais c'est évidemment la faible couverture des programmes d'assurance et d'assistance. Le constat est que ce ne sont pas des activités ponctuelles, les ressources seraient mal investies que si on se dédie à des activités ponctuelles et des interventions de court terme. Il faut, afin d'avoir un impact durable sur la vulnérabilité climatique, promouvoir, financer, dans notre rôle de banque de développement, l'extension verticale et horizontale de la protection sociale pour que davantage de risques sociaux soient couverts et pour qu'un pourcentage plus élevé de la population puisse en bénéficier. En termes de types de projets qui peuvent avoir un impact à long terme sur la protection face au choc climatique ou la dégradation de l'environnement, l'AFD finance ou cofinance au Sahel ou en Asie des programmes Cash Plus. Et donc, cette combinaison de transferts monétaires avec des mesures d'accompagnement permet d'une part d'avoir des revenus stables et prévisibles pendant la période de soudure en bénéfice de personnes qui souffrent d'une insécurité chronique. Et pour cela, il est très important et nos financements s'orientent à accompagner la mise en œuvre d'identifiants uniques ou de registres sociaux. Et sur la mesure d'accompagnement, toutes les mesures de renforcement de capital humain, d'inclusion productive permettent également de diversifier les moyens de subsistance et donc de maximiser les impacts positifs sur l'environnement et l'adaptation. Un point, avant de passer à la transition juste, la protection sociale en santé à l'AFD est très importante et permet d'accroître la résilience des individus face aux impacts sur la santé du changement climatique. Donc, on cherche à avoir une cohérence entre des politiques d'offres et de demande pour développer des systèmes qui permettent que les personnes soient prises en charge face à des maladies vectorielles, mais également à des maladies chroniques qui résultent de l'augmentation des températures, par exemple. Sur la transition juste, et je finis sur ce point, dire qu'il y a une réflexion interne à l'AFD pour prendre en compte les aspects sociaux de cette transition énergétique. Ça engage plusieurs divisions en cherchant à optimiser l'impact social et l'effectivité de ces mesures, avec une augmentation depuis 5-6 ans des opérations, que ce soit sur l'appui aux populations vulnérables, l'impact, l'analyse des impacts redistributifs, réforme fiscalité verte, etc. Et ici, toutes les mesures de protection sociale qu'on peut prendre pour compenser les perdants, que ce soit du secteur formel ou informel, et accepter et assurer surtout l'acceptabilité sociale, requièrent de 3 éléments. Modéliser les impacts, être sûr qu'on analyse la consommation et voir que les revenus de remplacement atténuent l'augmentation des prix en raison de la suppression des subventions. comprendre bien les effets pour ne pas se limiter à les impacts directs, mais avoir aussi une vision des conséquences indirectes sur les populations, sur les communautés, sur les gouvernements locaux, bien calibrer avec l'analyse de ces impacts les besoins des personnes et envisager des mesures de long terme. Et finalement, à nouveau, on revient aux besoins d'outils opérationnels, de registres sociaux, de mécanismes de paiement qui sont à la base pour pouvoir venir en aide et mettre en œuvre toutes les mesures de politique sociale. Et l'AFD, donc, se mobilise à cette fin. Merci beaucoup, Martin. Je vous repasse la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Carlos. Thank you very much for this very informative presentation and overview of AFD's activity in this field. And also, I'll take a few points from your intervention. You underlined some of the key challenges was the need for long-term programs rather than merely specific short-term responses. And this is one of the challenges that country may face. And another challenge that you underlined was the need for beyond resource mobilization, also advocacy and capacity building to make sure that social protection is included in the work of national agencies dealing with the environmental policies and climate change mitigation policies, which is not the case, not necessarily the case. And this is actually something that you were referring to, Ana Maria, when you got disconnected. Perhaps Ana Maria, if you want to conclude your intervention, are you back with us? I cannot see you on my screen. Yes, there you are. Please, Ana Maria, if you want to conclude your intervention.
Thank you so much, and apologies for that mishap. I'll try to get you back to where we left off. I was just trying to introduce the challenges that we've had in implementing the programs, which are climate related, promoting on resilience, but how is it that we've missed out on the social protection? And one of such is saying that we do undertake these activities, as I earlier mentioned. However, the activities that are going on under the social protection are not linked. I'll give an example of the flagship social cash transfer program under the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services. It provides cash transfers to vulnerable households. Some of these households are also beneficiaries of the climate change projects, which I've spoken about. However, the interventions which are being undertaken under that program and what we're doing, there's nowhere where the documentation meets so that we're able to know that are these the same beneficiaries or not, and what is the impact of the resilience building that we're undertaking and the social cash transfer on the same populations. So the integrations of the programs would consolidate the impact of reducing vulnerabilities due to environmental degradation. If we could only come to the same table and agree on what framework are we going to use when we're dealing with these populations. The other challenge that we face is although climate change related interventions in the Zambian communities seek to address vulnerability and tackle poverty reduction, they are not necessarily called social protection interventions. We talked about them as climate change, resilience building, mitigation, adaptation, but never called social protection. And are not even part of the national protection policy, national social protection policy framework. This is despite the definition of social protection by SPICB definition saying social protection is a set of policies and programs aimed at preventing and protecting all people against poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion throughout their life cycle, placing a particular emphasis on vulnerable groups. This means ensuring adequate protection for all who need it, including children, people of working age in case of maternity, sickness, work injury, or for those without jobs, persons with disability, and older persons. This protection can be provided through social insurance, tax-funded social benefits, social assistance services, public works programs, and other schemes guaranteeing basic income security and access to essential services. So essentially, in as much as we don't call our climate-related programs as part of addressing social protection, much of the work that we're doing is that, except we haven't coded it, we don't document it, we don't report it. The third challenge is climate change interventions do create green jobs within interventions in communities, but these are not assessed to see if they meet decent work requirements. That include provision of social protection. So our project does create green jobs to a very large extent as we support increased household farm production and community productivity in the process of building climate resilience within those communities to adapt and mitigate climate risks. However, the nature of the jobs created do not meet decent work standards as they are mainly informal and short-term contracts and lack social security benefits. And most of the times they don't have the formal contracts. So with flagship projects in Zambia supported by the ILO, such as the Green Jobs Project, in the construction and energy climate-related projects, we can derive the important lessons from there to provide decent work while at the same time promoting resilience building and adaptation to climatic shocks. So the above challenges do sum up into one of lack of coordination of various interventions at the national and community level, whether climate-related or social protection. I think that is where the major challenge is coming from. If we could sit on the table, and that is asking us that this lack of coordination between the different ministries that are implementing different interventions remains the bedrock of this challenge, as lack of clear information, data, and comprehensive documentation of available services where they can be found, as well as who's providing that information. So clarity will improve coordination and the integration of this. And I think if we went ahead to do that, the nexus between climate change and social protection will be enhanced. Zambia has many opportunities to say where we are right now, despite those challenges with the programs that are going on. We have the single window registry and the Cash Plus initiative. So I'll speak about this, which are currently going on in the country. So under the single window initiative, which is a window registry implemented by the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services, the social protection interventions available in each community are mapped and linked to beneficiaries. So by ensuring that the climate-related interventions are captured and well articulated and documented through the single window registry, beneficiaries of the social protection and climate-related interventions can be linked. That means we will be able to see how vulnerabilities are being reduced to those that are suffering from climatic shocks and environmental degradation. So this can be coordinated by linking vulnerable people to services that suits their needs, including the need of being adapted to climate change or building resilience. We also have the Cash Plus interventions, which is a second opportunity, which lies in the recent Cash Plus initiative that the government is planning to roll out. It seeks to link beneficiaries of the social cash transfer to additional benefits, such as health, education, and access to information. So we are seeing an opportunity is this, that the climate-related interventions are a perfect fit for additional services that beneficiaries of the cash transfer can obtain through the Cash Plus program. It's just budding, it's just starting, it's just being rolled out. So we see that if we could have space, we need to do that. So the Cash Plus relies on the single window registry mentioned earlier, which maps existing interventions and links to them. So you could see how it is going. If we went ahead, which I think we should do, it's going to roll out very well. Then the National Social Protection Policy review currently going on in the country through the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services is responsible for many social protection programs and is currently reviewing the policy, which will lead to the designing of a new one to cover a period of another 5 years. There's an opportunity to link climate-related issues to social protection at the policy level as an entry point. And that is going to make it even much easier for any other program beyond what is being done in community development, Ministry of Labor and Social Services, and what is being done in green economy, Ministry of Green Economy, to be implemented once the implementation plan of this policy is developed. The fourth opportunity that we currently have is the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment is developing the Green Growth National Strategy. And this is the first ever green growth strategy that we're doing. And it's very important to be categorical how interventions and programs fostering green growth will integrate social protection and be able to monitor, document, and report on the same. This process should be linked to the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services process to review and develop the National Social Protection Policy. So this is what we wanted to share as what our programs are able to do, how we're working with communities on the ground, how we're working at national level, strengthening the institutional capacity of government ministries and departments, But at the same time, how does this nexus between climate change and social protection be enhanced? Where are the opportunities? What are the challenges? And we really see that there are so many opportunities and we need to just grab them. It's good to be here and thank you for giving me the opportunity to conclude this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, for your intervention. I'll pick up a few points, perhaps. You mentioned, like previous speakers, the question and the challenge of coordination amongst ministries, but also between local, regional, and national government, which I think is important. And you also refer to something that has been addressed and that is essential, is the prevalence of the informal economy, of informal workers, and the need to address the prevalence of informality, which at the global level is represent about 4 billion people, like more than half of workers throughout the world are in the informal economy. And this is critical as we want to expand coverage of social protection system. That takes me to the second part of our discussion, where we try to discuss the global challenges and look at the big picture, because as we were discussing, we know that this is about our planet, but this is also about reducing inequalities, and this is about protecting the most vulnerable. And to talk about this, we're glad to have with us today Nicolas Bidot, our first discussant, who is the chief of the Social Protection Department of the World Food Programme. Nicolas, thank you so much for being with us today. I don't know whether you're connected or not. I cannot see on my screen. Yes, you are. Sorry. Thank you so much for being with us, Nicolas. Can you tell us more about what the WFP does in the field of social protection, and how is food security, of course, impacted by climate change, but how can social protection respond to this? The floor is yours, Nicolas.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Antoine, for the invitation. Happy to represent WFP in this discussion. I think it's the intervention from the panelists for a very vibrant, fantastic discussion. Coming from the World Food Programme, let me bring some reflection on how we bring the climate issue and social protection, and how we've been dealing with it, or how we're dealing with it in from the World Food Programme. So for us, climate change is very key. It's a key driver of the global food crisis, of the food insecurity that we're seeing. The only problem we have is the gap continues to rise. So at the moment, we have more than 800 million people that go to bed hungry. Now, as we know, with climate change, the situation is now, but with climate change and the future projection of future severity, frequency of extreme weather event, that's not going to go away. That's going to go even worse. So we are facing a situation now, and we're facing an even more drastic situation in the future. Now, so we need a solution that will bring us the scale that we need to address the issue. And we need a solution that will connect with the climate change and the climate issue that are exacerbating the food insecurity and malnutrition issues we're seeing. We've heard from the previous session that social protection is a fantastic platform to bring at scale some of the response to the crisis. Now, the issue we have, and the government have been responding to this. So the government have been scaling up horizontally, vertically to address the global food crisis, the response to COVID. Now, we need to make sure that we are using social protection for two things. One, to address the food insecurity and nutrition issues, and two, linking that with the climate. And we've heard from the previous panelists that the link between social protection and climate is not necessary. So we need adjustment to the social protection systems to be able to be more adaptive and more shock responsive, bringing solutions to the climate issue, the current climate situation and the future climate situation. In order to do that, we need, and we've heard from the panelists, very much two things. One, we need integrated approaches, and we need innovation. And WFP has been working with government partners in that space to bring, to expand and to bring innovation, to bring integrated approach into social protection to mitigate the shocks, environmental degradation, and climate shocks. So let me take you through some of the instruments that we've been supporting government with. And in order to do that, I like very much to look at the different time windows when you look at a shock, once you consider a shock. One is there's a shock, but a lot of things needs to happen before the shock. And it will start to go in that anticipatory window. And there's a lot of work that has happened in starting to bring anticipatory action into, that's something very common in when you look at climate response, anticipatory windows, but also looking at how we bring that into social protection. So an example is anticipatory action means that you act on a forecast before a shock happens and you intervene with anticipatory action. So in anticipation to mitigate the future impact of that shock. Now, linking with social protection offers obviously a great platform, and we've done that in Somalia as an example, where in Somalia, WFP is implementing the National Social Protection Program called BAX-NAMO on behalf of the government with support from the World Bank. Very recently, at the beginning of 2022, there was a forecast of a fourth failed rain season in Somalia. And so what WFP has been doing is implementing already a cash transfer to registered vulnerable households for them to start to use the cash transfer to mitigate the future shock of that drought, the failed rain and the drought. So very much a very innovative example of using social protection in anticipation of a shock in that anticipatory windows based on forecast. Now, the second window is very much looking at the early action right after a shock. And again, there's several instruments that WFP has been working with government. Example is, we've heard that before, so is insurance. In order to deliver insurance at the time of a shock, you need to do a lot of work in anticipation of that earlier on to make sure that premiums are delivered to vulnerable households. Two examples I want to bring to you. One is in Fiji, where WFP has been working with the UNCDF on climate risk insurance for vulnerable households in the context of extreme storm, extreme winds, and climatic storm. So access to climate risk insurance. Another one very innovative is the work we've been doing, WFP, in Ethiopia with the PSNP, which is the National Social Protection Program, whereby vulnerable farmers who are registered on the PSNP participate in extra days of public works to work on risk reduction. So soil management, water conservation, agroforestry, and that extra days of public works very much helps them pay and access weather index insurance. So the combination of both the public works to address the issues around land degradation, restoration, things like this, with a view to have them protected in future climate through accessing climate risk insurance. Instead of paying for it, they work for it and get the insurance coverage. So that's during sort of the immediate time of a shock where insurance kicks in right after the shock. And then there is the longer term window, which is starting to look at resilience. And in that space also, WFP is doing quite a lot of work. Obviously, there's a lot of instrument that WFP has done around cash for work, food for asset, for example, working in the Sahel, for example, with the vulnerable communities, looking at integrated resilience activities. And that includes, for example, land restoration, increased access to market, increased access to water and energy. And in the Sahel, for example, WFP is supporting 1.8 million vulnerable households in 2,000 villages that are in this climate vulnerable and shock-prone areas. So that's been a fantastic work focusing on integrated resilience activities. Now the discussion we're having in the Sahel is very much to bring that to scale and more sustainably, as our colleague from AFD described, and that goes with using social protection. So using social protection to bring to scale and sustainability some already existing integrated resilience mechanism. So that's some of the examples. I don't want to take the floor too long, but reflecting on what was said earlier, I think to me there's some key conclusions here. One is that social protection offers a great platform for bringing at scale some of those response to mitigate future climate shock. It's not the panacea, as we have heard from our colleague from Bangladesh. It's a great tool. However, we need to continue to work and adjust the social protection system. That requires integrated approach. That requires a system thinking approach, starting to link all the different systems that contribute to that common objective and social protection. It requires piloting new approaches, experimenting, piloting, and putting to scale. It requires strengthening the systems, and that includes through technology, blockchain and all elements, but we've heard also from the colleague in AFD is better around the registration, better around the payment and the delivery systems. Important is the having availability climate data, and I mentioned the forecast is one element, but also looking at the longer term climate projection. We have the IPCC, which is a good element, but what does it mean in terms of future impact on food security, nutrition, value chain? And WFP has been working with governments on a tool called CLEAR that looks at future climate, but looking at the impact of that on food security, nutrition, and value chains to turn that into actions and recommendations around, including social protection. We've worked also the importance of working on policies and social protection related policies, and in that to integrate climate objectives in those policies. We've heard the importance of coordination and governance, and I think the example from the colleague from Zambia has been fantastic, bringing governments, bringing local actors, bringing private sectors. And last but not least is advocacy. We work in a space that is often misunderstood or not very well understood, and we need to make sure that we are out there conveying the importance of bringing social protection expansion, but also as it relates to addressing climate impact. Thank you, Martin.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Nicolas, and we'll have the pleasure to come back to you for a second round of questions afterwards. But thank you very much for your intervention. And you've used several times the term resilience, which I think is really key here in the discussion we're having today, as the world is going through various shocks, and we know that this is here to stay, and that societies are going to have to be more and more, and social protection systems are going to be more and more adaptive and responsive to those shocks. Thank you also for somehow summing up, wrapping up the discussion and on two key aspects, on the need for integrated approaches and on the need for innovation. I will also perhaps add a third one, but you've already alluded to this, and previous speakers as well, is the need for social cohesion and adhesion to the policies that are being implemented. Here, social protection is key. And another key pillar is social dialogue, is ownership from population, from workers' organization. And as a representative of TUAC, of course, I'm one of those that of course, urges upon government to use social dialogue as a key tool to create ownership and support to public policies. And in this area, the ILO, as the International Labour Organization, as the UN tripartite agency gathering business organization, employers representative, and workers organization, is in a unique place to foster this social contract, this collective agreement around a transformative agenda to build more resilient societies. So I'm therefore really happy to invite our second and last discussant today, Marie-Christina Dankmeyer. You are the social protection and climate change specialist at the ILO. Thank you so much for being with us today. Could you tell us more about the role of the ILO as a unique tripartite organization to foster this just transition through social protection? And then we'll go for a first round of questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you want to take the floor, or write your questions in the chat box. Marie-Christina, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
And just to say, maybe I'll start with a few reflections because we had quite a few interesting points that I wanted to build on from our speakers. And then I'll end with the ILO's work and role in this area for sure. I'll come back to that. So maybe to start off with a reflection on the overall conceptual focus of the session. As you pointed out, there are these multiple mechanisms or pathways linking environmental depletion and climatic or climate change related impacts to the issue of poverty and poverty reduction. So we're quite clear in terms of the impacts of sudden onset events, slow onset processes, and also then climate policy impacts on people. I mean, you mentioned the pathways earlier. We talked about food security earlier in the session too. We talked about food prices and the impact that may have on people. And we may also face this issue in the context of climate policies if we leave it unaddressed. we had talked about the direct impact on lives and well-being in terms of health. And I think here we need to keep in mind that, I mean, there will be increased costs to health. The WHO currently estimates those at about $2 to $4 billion US dollars per year by 2030. But at the same time, we may also, if we manage the transition well, we may also see improvements in terms of people's well-being. And so I think that's something else we need to track to be able to respond to it. Then we see different, so lower income gains, different impacts on livelihoods, agricultural yields were mentioned earlier, but then also issues around forestry, tourism, natural resource dependent sectors that will be affected. And we see reduced labor productivity, especially among workers working outside. And when we look at all the jobs that are linked to ecosystem services, 1.2 billion jobs right now closely linked, those will see significant impacts. And that doesn't even touch upon, you know, the issues around conflict, displacement, etc. But I think what is still a bit unclear is how we effectively move from just addressing these issues, preparedness and response, to actually working towards a longer term strategy on, you know, not just reacting, but actually, and providing compensation too, but actually looking at incentivizing sustainable and green investments, decisions, income diversification and innovation. Nicola, you mentioned it earlier. And also how we provide people with resources and you know, the time that they need to further develop their skills in a changing labor market, and also accessing new decent employment opportunities. And I think Zambia was quite interesting in this regard. To start off with a reflection on Bangladesh, maybe in that order, and then I'll move to Zambia. I think we see in the case of Bangladesh that the scale of events and impacts and their frequency too makes these recurrent preparedness and response mechanisms quite difficult in the medium to long term. And so, I mean, the latest IPCC assessment report actually shows that, you know, we see current and future impacts already. There is the potential of social protection to address them, but the report also says that adaptation will not be sufficient, and there are large adaptation gaps too among lower income population groups. And so we see quite a bit of work in this area emerging. Countries, what Mohamed Nazmul was saying, pre-funding of social assistance, building up reserves during better times for future support. Internationally, we see the COP27 outcome of a loss and damage fund to be established, the global shield that was pushed by the G7 against climate risks. And all of these are really important and could leverage and help strengthen existing social protection mechanisms and reach people with payouts. But we also know that action in the area of social protection will have to go beyond this sort of, you know, preparedness and response. And we need to look at also from a sustainable financing perspective, how we reconsider the role of not just non-contributory mechanisms, but also contributory mechanisms, because we see, you know, implications for social insurance in terms of benefits adequacy. So on the one hand, regularly checking for adequacy, because people are facing these physical and also transition risks, looking at ways to more closely link social insurance and social assistance. So for example, cross-checking beneficiary lists before or after shocks. This was actually done quite well in Mozambique rather recently, again, also during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then looking at comprehensiveness, so how we actually cover different life contingencies in the context of climate-related risks. So, for example, if we take sudden onset events, also looking at disability or survivors' pensions, and also how social insurance can actually manage investment portfolios. So to basically track and develop scenarios for different kinds of impacts, and how, you know, climate change can affect individuals, but also the overall investment portfolio and how that needs to be managed. And I think those are just some of the emerging lessons in the area of social insurance. I think when we look at the Zambia case now, it provided a good example in terms of highlighting the importance of links to services, so including access to various trainings and skills, resilience building, so for people to actually reskill and re-enter the labor market where that's possible, but also the importance of the link to sustainable management of natural resources, for example, regeneration or community management of forests. We've seen similar approaches in Ethiopia and Kenya or in India as well. In the case of the latter, unfortunately, now there seems to be a trend towards more investment in infrastructure rather than natural resources, with a lower percentage also going towards wages and a higher percentage towards the assets themselves. So I think we're hoping to see more of natural resource management in these programs, because they actually nicely address climate change adaptation and mitigation together in the same intervention. And that's quite well documented. I mean, for Ethiopia, there's actually total reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions from land management under the Productive Safety Net program, estimated at about 1.5%. of the overall emissions reductions in Ethiopia's national determined contributions. So I think that's it's progress. And I think on the one hand, we need to track those impacts more, and we also then need to draw lessons from it, how we actually design these types of programs in the future. And I think beyond that, we often tend to forget a basic function of social protection, to give people the financial leeway to avoid environmentally harmful practices and to adopt more environmentally friendly technologies, behaviors, especially when we look at the importance of messaging and asset transfers as well. And social protection also provides the necessary security for entrepreneurial risk-taking, right? And so for green jobs going forward too. And just a lesson coming out of all of the different examples mentioned, we see that it remains key to actually anchor all of these approaches in national commitments, in policies and plans. And I think we see that, sometimes in contexts where all these different interventions are dispersed, they may not be labeled social protection. There is a need for a more coherent approach. And so I think going forward, and this is something that the ILO is also supporting, the need for countries to actually include social protection in their just transition strategies. So coming out of COP26, there was the Just Transition Declaration with commitments to facilitate a just transition and develop just transition strategies by a number of countries. I think right now globally, we have about 49 countries that either have developed or want to develop such strategies. Then we see it is really important to actually anchor, and this came out of the earlier session too, to anchor these approaches in nationally determined contributions. So to actually have a high level commitment that includes different policy areas, including social protection as well. We see that it's really important, we heard it from Zambia earlier, to review social protection policies with this lens, to be explicit about impacts on people, but also the measures to contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation where that's possible within the existing social protection system. And also for climate policies, so the green growth policy was mentioned, to recognize the role of social protection or related livelihood support for the achievement of their objectives, of the policy objectives. And so, Mata, I'll close in a moment, but just to come back to the latest sort of international processes going on this year at COP, we had quite an interesting development in the final cover text. And this was also something that we at the ILO have been following and also working on a just transition pavilion at COP. The final cover text of the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan of COP27 actually includes a formulation now that just and equitable transition pathways must be based on nationally defined development priorities and include social protection to mitigate potential impacts associated with the transition. and also highlights the importance of the role of instruments related to social solidarity and social protection in mitigating not just climate change impacts, but the impacts of applied measures, so the impacts of climate policies. And so I think it's really important that this is acknowledged. There is now also a work program on just transition that is supposed to be starting in a high-level ministerial roundtable that we're also aiming to support and inform. But at the same time, it's also really important that we move from, just addressing these issues, these negative impacts, to actually supporting people to actively contribute to the transition. So to reskill and then eventually also be able to re-enter the labor market. And so this is just kind of my key takeaway for now, and I'll hand it back to you and we can go into a little bit more detail on some of these things in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was very, very informative, very useful, and including some of the key points that you have highlighted after the intervention from previous speakers. We still have about 20 minutes to pursue this discussion. The discussion, I think, is already very lively and stimulating, so I'm not going to ask any specific questions. I'd just like to give each of you an opportunity to react to what has been said. I don't know whether there's any questions on the chat box, not at this stage, so perhaps I'll come back to you, Mohammed Nazmul Hassan, to give you an opportunity to react to what has been said with regard to your country's initiatives, perhaps also with regard to some of the takeaways from COP27 that Christina just mentioned, the loss and damages facility, or other points that have been raised by Nicola previously. If you have any specific comments, or if you just want to highlight perhaps what would be, in your view, the way forward for your country, what are the next steps to pursue your work and to enhance social protection systems to mitigate the climate change and its degradations. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin, again. And the Bangladesh government allocate like a social safety net increase year to year, I mentioned earlier. And in the current fiscal year, in 2022 and 23, it is 1,135.76 Bangladeshi taka. And this is around 2.55% of total GDP of Bangladesh. And Bangladesh also follow the global classification system in case of social safety net program. And we adopted various long-term policy and also the plans, like we already adopted Delta Plan. This is a 100 years long plan. And this is the water-centric because we are the riverine country. And we also follow the short-term 8 to 5 year plan. Now it is the rolling plan in our country. And also in NAPA, National Adaptation Program of Action, and also Bangladesh formulate the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. So in this Bangladesh Climate Change Action Plan, it is based on the 6 pillars, and among them, the number 1 is focused on the social safety net, health, this sort of thing. So our government try to mainstreaming the social safety net in every plan and every and also as well as the climate change. And so climate change and social safety net now in our country is a cross-cutting issue, and we try to incorporate in these 2 things in all the policies and planning instrument. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And I'll turn to you, Anna Maria. Do you have any, would you like to react to some of the points that have been made, or would you like perhaps to highlight a key message on the next steps for your country as a national coordinator?
Anna Maria? Thank you very much. And I take it the need for being more innovative, and I would want to say we need to be more deliberate, more intentional in ensuring that we really link climate change, resilience building, adaptation, mitigation with social protection. I want to build on what Elia shared. Is in the current 8th National Development Plan of the country, we do have a dedicated pillar on environmental sustainability, which talks everything: resilience building, mitigation, we are targeting reducing vulnerability of our people, especially the very vulnerable. And even what we shared is the activities, what we do, the interventions, what we do, they will not talk about social protection. The same National Development Plan also has a section which discusses social protection, but there's no connection. So we need to sit, and we have the opportunity of the national, the review of the policy on social protection and the development of the Green Growth Strategy. For us, those are very critical. And the lessons that we're learning from the Cash Plus project and also the Green Jobs project that was done. And I followed what Nicholas was saying, equally with what Christina was saying, is in what has happened in other places, especially that you need to think long term. So we're not talking about resilience building, we're not talking about reducing vulnerability. What can we anticipate now? In our work on climate change, we're also promoting improved weather information and hydrometeorological information. So we work with the meteorological department to improve their system so that they deliver better. We're able to anticipate whether there will be a flood, whether there will be what in the medium and in the long term. And a lot of assessments of what is likely to happen, 30-year assessments, forecasting for 30 years. But why aren't we using this, as I've listened this earlier on from both Nicholas and Christina, why aren't we using this information to better design or to better design our social protection activities and interventions? In as much as it is drawing from trying to do with climate change, we need to embed in there the social protection interventions so that we enhance the reduction of vulnerability, we make them much better. The other issue is, it was very strange when we kept interrogating these questions that you shared with us. How do we answer them? And then you start seeing that actually the green flags are there. Can we enhance on them? And the red flags are there. So how can we sit now as a country to check these informal jobs that we're creating, these green jobs that we're working on the program? How do we make them decent and green jobs? How can we move from there? So that is the discussion which is very interesting. And for Zambia, it's something that we'd want to pursue. In fact, it has come late, but as everything, it's never too late. There's always a starting point. And yes, on the gender issues, you will notice that gender has been already integrated in everything that we do. No one questions that. Occupational health and safety issues, they are integrated, but it's something that we need to work on. HIV/AIDS, it's critical. But while we've been silent on social protection, and yet we're discussing reducing vulnerability, reducing poverty, ensuring that people's livelihoods are much better, even in the face of climate change. So yeah, so the coordination aspect, the data availability, bringing the right people around the table to discuss and ensuring that implementation, and also the design of the programs and projects going forward should be deliberate to embed the link between social protection and climate change in every climate change activities that we're doing. So even in the design criteria, if we're going to do an intervention or a program, one of the criteria is how is it going to address social protection, or where is the nexus? How are we going to be reporting with this? It should be demanded on everyone doing any program on climate change to report on how we are helping to address issues of social protection. Thank you.
Very much, Anna Maria, for those very thoughtful remarks, and also the optimist and positive remarks, concluding remarks, which I think are also necessary and very much welcome. You mentioned again the question of long term. This is something that Carlos also referred to in his intervention when he discussed and he presented the actions led by the AFD. Carlos, would you like to react to what has been said during the discussion?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Non, c'est des échanges très riches avec beaucoup d'éléments et on pourrait rester des heures. Mais quelques éléments à signaler. Je pense que la coordination est nécessaire et surtout sortir d'une approche en silo. Ça a été dit. On a en ce moment une expérience, on essaye en République dominicaine de travailler autour de la gestion intégrée des ressources en eau et d'intégrer la protection sociale comme un instrument pour cette gestion de l'eau dans un bassin versant. et ça implique de mettre autour de la table le ministère de l'Environnement, le ministère de l'Agriculture et tous les acteurs de la protection sociale. Et donc, c'est pas évident puisque, disons que c'est pas automatique les liens qui se créent, faute d'habitude. Et pour faire une critique interne, même en interne à AFD, entre divisions, il faut aussi casser ces murs et aller parler aux collègues d'à côté d'agriculture, leur dire voilà ce qu'on pourrait faire, voilà la protection sociale, ce à quoi elle peut contribuer. Et donc, il y a une question, à nouveau, je reviens sur de plaidoyer, de avoir des effets démonstratifs, que ce soit à travers des pilotes, que ce soit à travers des études. Je voudrais mentionner deux études en particulier. Sur l'assurance, la protection sociale et en particulier l'assurance sociale, avec l'AFD a financé une étude faite par les collègues du BIT sur l'importance et sur ce qui peut être fait autour de l'assurance sociale. Donc, c'est aussi montrer quelles sont les possibilités et en gros, quelques conclusions, c'est le besoin de renforcer, d'avoir une approche universelle, d'avoir des ponts entre l'assurance, comme mentionnait Christina, entre l'assurance et l'assistance. Entre autres, une autre étude sur la santé, un flagship report avec la Banque mondiale sur précisément le lien entre santé et maladies chroniques, les effets du changement climatique sur les maladies chroniques. Et ça, c'est très important dans la mesure où ça montre au gouvernement ces liens existent et le besoin de mettre en œuvre non seulement des politiques d'offre de soins, mais de financement contre le risque financier et couvrir ce risque financier. Et pour parler de long terme, juste mentionner, je pense que ça a été dit, le besoin de diversifier les sources de financement. Le Global Shield, le bouclier global de protection sociale, c'est une initiative très intéressante. Ces financements internationaux doivent venir à la mise en œuvre d'autres mécanismes, que ce soit des prêts de contingence, mais très important. Si on travaille en faveur un plaidoyer en faveur de la protection sociale, il y a plus de chances que des ressources nationales puissent être mobilisées. Je m'arrête là. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Carlos. It was very, very interesting, and actually, it's very timely that you refer to the need for a universal approach in designing the social protection responses. And it's actually a question we just had on the chat from one of the participants on whether you panelists agree that a universal system where you have the potential to reach everybody, as everybody is potentially vulnerable, is the best way to prepare for being adaptive and shock responsive, rather than designing a specific shock responsive or adaptive social protection program. So that really echoes what you just said, Carlos. Perhaps, Nicola, you want to react on this, or more generally on the discussion we've had. There's been many suggestions and many important things that have been said. Nicola, if you want to take the floor for a few minutes.
I think on the question, yes, I think, the objective is very much to build social protection system, not just, specific programs. And I think we're here to make sure we increase coverage, we increase quality, adequacy of social protection program. At the same time, making sure that they are adapted to shocks when shocks occur. And for us also working also at the nexus between humanitarian and development, making sure that all the investment that are there in the humanitarian space also help build the systems and the government system. So they are better able to then use some of the mechanisms that are there and created to also respond to through strengthened national social protection system. So yes, definitely. I think it's about bringing, the broad-based social protection coverage, quality, adequacy, but making sure also that they are addressing some of the key outcome, food security, more food security, nutrition outcomes targeted to the right vulnerable groups, but also more shock responsive. And we've seen there's a lot of work that's happening in that space. And I think there's an acceleration of that by the government in view of COVID and the global food crisis. So we're in a space where there's a momentum at the moment to build from the systems, accelerate the systems, and making them also more responsive. But it's not just about having specific programs. I think reacting on some of the points that were made earlier, I think to me what's critical is data. One is to understand what the current vulnerabilities, and there's a lot of new vulnerabilities, and making sure that those vulnerable households are covered, registered, which is not always the case. So making sure we have the right expansion to cover the new vulnerabilities. That's the vulnerabilities now, but what's going to be the future vulnerabilities due to the global due to the climate change? And it's what I was saying earlier is using some of the IPCC projection to say, so what do they mean? What do they mean in terms of future vulnerabilities, and are those vulnerabilities covered and not covered? What can we do about the future vulnerabilities? So already projecting us in that space using the future climate projection, but in terms of what do they mean in terms of new vulnerabilities, and very close to us at the World Food Programme is what it means in terms of future food insecurity, future malnutrition, future essential needs. Tools are there to help in that process, and we've been doing that with support from the UK Met Office, for example, in Afghanistan, in Nepal. Innovation, I think, is critical. In that space, it's experimenting. We should not be afraid to experiment, to try it, and the view is to think differently, think systems, connecting systems, not just all systems, but the one that share the common objective of addressing future impact of climate and putting to scale using social protection as a means to do that. And so innovation is critical. Learning, I think we've heard that. There's also a lot of good examples. There's a lot of good practices here and there by different governments at national, subnational level. And I think us also in the global space is to make sure we give visibility to things that have been working so we can replicate better. And so working with champions in that space in different governments and making sure that their expertise is shared with other governments is very, very important, because there's a lot of good practices out there, good experiences. One point on also connecting is, I think there's the COP. It's about bringing more social protection into a climate platform. There's also other platforms, like there's an anticipatory action, there's a global dialogue on anticipatory action, making sure also there is social protection. But in those social future, and there's going to be a lot of those in 2023 also on social protection, making sure there's a climate agenda going into this. So making sure that also at the global level, there's a good discussion between climate and social protection with either climate entry point or social protection entry point. Socialprotection.org, making sure there's more climate out of those, bringing evidence, bringing learning and sharing. And I think the last point that I want to make is the importance of funding. The Global Shield was mentioned. It's a fantastic new venture. There's a lot of appetite. There's a lot of interest. Insurance and social protections are a foundation of that. So we should be really working with all the governments and the bilaterals who are investing in the Global Shield to make sure that social protection is really there. It's there as a foundation. We need to operationalize that. And thinking innovative financing, there's a lot of space there also for us to be creative in that space, bringing some risk financing, learning from how government have been able to adapt some of the financing for social protection, but obviously linking that with a climate objective. So thanks for those reflections. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you so much, Nicolas, for bringing those ideas on the table, including on data, what you just said on the need to enhance foreseeability and predictability. And that echoes what Anna Maria from Zambia mentioned earlier, and also your last point on fundings and the need for, of course, developing innovative financing tools, but also the broader question of how we ensure a global solidarity mechanism to cope with this global challenge that impacts the world in a different manner. In a way, climate change also acts as it will reveal the inequalities within our societies and between our societies. So it's also important that we have this discussion at the global level on how we redistribute and how we share the burden of climate change and of the responses at the global level and within countries. And this is what social protection is all about. And this also takes me to another question that is very important for the trade union movement. Also is the question of the role of multinational enterprises and their contribution to the policies that we are to implement and to social protection systems and their financing in general. Perhaps I will turn to Christina from the ILO for a few remarks before we conclude, and to Antoine for the conclusion. Christina, the floor is yours.
First of all, to just react to the USP question in the chat, I think especially when we look at these sudden onset events that we see in certain contexts these days, for example, Dominica 2017, 90% of the population were affected by a hurricane. And so I think that just highlights in the sudden onset context, but also when we look at slow onset processes and the transition, it is safe to say that everyone will be affected by climate change and also climate policies and measures at some point in their life. And so, I mean, I think it just further reiterates the need for, progressively working towards universal social protection. I think it's really important to say, though, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's, the same principles that we have been applying in the area of social protection still apply. And I think the first thing that we need to do when actually, thinking about next steps is seeing what's there, what we can work with. So essentially assessing social protection systems in terms of, what we have, what is already there in terms of support for people, but also what social protection can do going forward to support people's and countries' adaptation and mitigation efforts. And so this is something we're doing right now in different countries, in Colombia with the just transition strategy perspective, in Egypt focusing a little bit more on adaptation. There are also, really important considerations for the involvement of social partners in these early stages of actually just seeing what's there, rather than only involving trade unions and employers, later on in the process of implementation or monitoring. And so I think, the earlier you start with key actors around the table, the better. I think a second next step for us would then be working on countries' commitments. So, I mean, COP26 and 27 were quite important in that respect for countries to actually formulate those commitments, but we now need to follow up on those. I mean, COP27 was supposed to be the COP of implementation, and really we're still, in the starting phase, and we have a lot of commitments on the table. We have increasing strategies and action plans at country level and national adaptation plans as well, but we really aren't seeing the uptake that would be needed across policy areas, but also for social protection. I think what will be increasingly important too is then capacity building and development, because we still see that capacities in our area of work, but also across the fields of social protection and climate change are very dispersed, both in terms of international experts, but also on the side of governments, trade unions, and employers. And I think we need to kind of level the playing field and make sure that, everybody's on the same page, and we actually have not just the awareness, but also the capacities to actually implement some of these measures. This is where we're really investing now in capacity building measures in this area. And on Nicholas's point, in terms of facilitating kind of international exchange, there is the Social Protection and Climate Change Working Group under the USP2030 initiative. We can share the link in the chat, but you can also find it just on socialprotection.org. It's an online platform. We have, I think, about 200 people on the mailing list right now, which is facilitated by the ILO and the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. And we actually just had a working group meeting earlier today, where we kind of defined the different activities going forward, how we can strengthen coordination and cooperation across different agencies. And the key activities that I think will be implemented going forward, first of all, coordinating, what good examples we have and what works and what doesn't work. So different agencies are working on case studies. I know WFP is, different academic institutions, ILO as well. So to kind of bring that together and figure out, what we even have in terms of examples. Then actually looking at who does what. So how can we actually more effectively and efficiently work together on these things? And then as a third step, also maybe a joint statement at a technical level in terms of coming to an understanding of what really needs to be done over the next year. I mean, ahead of the next COP, but also in terms of, the longer term perspective in this area. And then I think just one more important point on financing. I think we also really need to look at the development of social protection financing options for a just transition. There are all kinds of financing tools for a just transition being developed, different sectoral costing exercises, etc. But I do think we need to figure out how our financing mechanisms actually fit in and how we look at fiscal space overall, rather than, just looking at the little piece of the pie or, trying to get climate financing to come our way. And I think this more holistic view of financing a just transition will be really important going forward. And so I think that's something that we would also like to work on. And I think this would also be a very interesting platform to actually engage social partners more, to look at, also their incentives to actually get engaged in terms of, making sure that from a trade union perspective, that workers, especially contributory mechanisms, are financially sustainable. From an employer's perspective, equally, that those mechanisms work. But also then, what do we do with investment portfolios? Just throwing ESG in there too. There are quite a few, interesting developments in this space that are not just relevant for governments and for international organizations, but also from the trade unions and employers' perspectives. And so just as an outlook, what's out there and all the different areas that we will have to tackle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And unfortunately, we are running a bit late, so we have to conclude. But thank you so much to all our panelists. It's been a truly fascinating discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I'm sure this discussion will continue, although this is an urgent matter. I'm sure we'll have plenty of other opportunities to pursue this discussion. Let's continue to be strategic. Let's be ambitious and bold, though. And let me now turn to Antoine for some concluding remarks. But thanks again to all of you for your participation, and thanks to all our speakers and discussants. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much to all speakers and attendees. We had two very rich sessions on respectively inflation and environmental degradation and the role of social protection in tackling these multiple crises. And I think both these panels, if I wanted to think of one common remark that emerged, was the importance of building indeed social protection systems and not only a great number of ad hoc responses. Tomorrow, we will continue this discussion about the role of social protection in tackling crises through a long debated question, which is now revisited, that is targeting versus universalism, starting at 1 p.m. Paris time, followed by a debate on the role of social protection in allowing individuals to sustainably escape poverty. Again, thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions, and very much looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.